Aloha ihau kako. Welcome everyone to the University of Hawaii at Hilo, and it's our honor at the Office of Hawaiian Affairs to host the first in a series of statewide community educational meetings and listening sessions on behalf of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs on one of the most important issues of our generation, and that is the future of military leased lands in the state of Hawaii. OHA most recently has taken a much more proactive role on this issue, given the sensitivity of the subject and at how fast this issue has been approaching all of us. And we want to share what we know about the issue. We want to hear from you because how you feel is greatly important to all of us, whether you are Hawaiian or non-Hawaiian, because this is an issue that affects all the people of Hawaii. So OHA's goal over the next few months and as we go into 2026 is to educate, it's to empower, it's to inform, it's to give you a voice, because your voice matters. It's a critical issue that we're faced with. It's one that leaders of a different generation faced back in the late 1950s and the early 1960s. And we're going to look at what some of those leaders faced back in the early 1960s and how they approached this issue. What we realize from that is that the issues we have before us today and the decisions we make, we need to be proud of those decisions, because the next generation are going to have to live with the decisions that we make today, all of us as a people. And so on behalf of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, thank you so much for coming. Happy holidays, everyone, on the eve of the holiday break. And we really appreciate on a Wednesday night your time here, and the staff at the University of Hawaii at Hilo that have given us this opportunity. Olelo community media that is live streaming this across the state and recording this across the state, because it's important that we have this presentation for others that cannot be here in person to see or to watch later. And so thank you so much for coming out. This is a major issue and there's a lot of information, and we're going to pack you with information tonight. So we're just apologizing up front for the information overload that is coming. And over the next hour, hopefully we can get through it within the next hour and 15 minutes. We're going to give you as much information that we have on this topic, and then we're looking forward to hearing from you, and that's important. And so I just want to mahalo everyone for coming, and we will pull up our first slide and we'll do brief introductions. And you know, while we are doing that, I'm just going to go ahead and introduce myself. My name is Kāwili St. I'm the chairperson of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs of the Board of Trustees. We can go to the next slide, Summer. I've had the privilege of serving our state as a former state senator, where I chaired the Water Land Committee. As a former member of the United States House of Representatives, where I sat for 2 years on the House Armed Services Committee and worked on 2 National Defense Authorization Acts. I also continue to serve as a lieutenant colonel in the United States Air Force. I've been in the United States military since 1999, commissioned in 2001, and still serve today. And I recently completed my master's degree from the United States Army War College on strategic studies over the last 2 years. And with that being said, I want to acknowledge something important about my background that is both deeply personal and is deeply relevant to why we are here tonight. You know, I come from a long line of Native Hawaiians who served in the United States military. My dad was a United States Marine. All his brothers either served in the United States Marines, the Army, or the Air Force. My great uncle served in World War II as Army Air Corps pilots. And so service to both Hawaii and our nation, the United States, runs deep in my family. And I wouldn't be the person I am today without the leadership, the discipline, and the perspective that the United States military has taught me. I've served in combat, in Iraqi freedom, and enduring freedom. I've seen the tragedy, I've seen the cost of war, and those experiences changed me. They shaped how I see the world and how I understand Hawaii's place in that world. But the reality is, that there are nations and there are actors throughout the world who do not share our values, whether it is the values of the Aloha spirit, is the values of Western democracy. They don't share our values, and they wish to do us harm. And so whether we embrace that or not, we must be prepared to defend Hawaii and to defend our homeland. At the same time, the United States of America is far from perfect. And it was imperfect to begin with. But I really believe in the hope and the promise that we can build something together, a future grounded in justice, accountability, and the empowerment of Native Hawaiians in our own homeland. So some may wonder, how can a Native Hawaiian who served in combat also stand at the front of negotiations or conversations that challenge the military's use of our lands? For me, these identities are not in conflict. They inform each other. My service gives me a unique perspective that very, very few people in the state of Hawaii have, if not any. That perspective is how the system works, how decisions are made, how the military views Hawaii. And it deepens my responsibility to ensure that Native Hawaiian interests, its lands, and its rights are protected. So tonight I'm here in that spirit, with humility, with aloha, and with a commitment to transparency and truth as we talk about the future of military leased lands in Hawaii. This time I want to hand it over to Summer Silva for her introduction.
Mahalo, and mahalo to all of you too. I'm actually a stand-in for our chief policy advocate who has been working in tandem with Chair Kahele for a long time preparing for this community engagement. So I want to give a little pause and a little time to sort of surface to you that I think at this time, at this moment, in terms of the number of hours and the dedication and the fluency in historical documents, in policy, in legislative proposals, in maps, in surveys, in the details, the very minutia. The person in this room who is most fluent in that is standing next to me. And I communicate that, I convey that to all of you because that is how personal and deeply invested his leadership is, and by way of his leadership, our agency. That kind of commitment to ensuring that whatever information, whatever historical documentation is in our possession that we have access to, that we might be privy to, that others in the community may not be, that the commitment to be as transparent and as timely with surfacing that information with all of you and in framing it in a way that allows each and every one of you to reach your own conclusions, to go to access the same original source documents that we have access to that are not actually currently available on any other website than the website that HOHA is presently hosting in some instances. That is the level of commitment that we have in this engagement around military leases for the duration of this conversation being relevant. And the work on this started before the news hit the headlines. The work on this started when this leadership transition happened and our own personal proximity to these issues became much more like time sensitive. I say that having worked on the Ching v. Isla case. I was one of the 2 attorneys who argued the case before the Hawaii Supreme Court. And for those of you less familiar with that particular case, that was the case around Pōhakuloa, around the state's obligation, its affirmative duty, like it had to be proactive in its trusteeship over those lands and over its stewardship of those lands as the lessor. It established a malama āina as a value that is legally mandated. And so the idea of Pōhakuloa, that lease coming up for expiration and potential renewal, and then the risk of condemnation speaks to decades of work that predated this particular conversation and speaks to aloha āina cultural icons who were part of the narrative and the story that made people care. Uncle Kuching, Auntie Maxine Kahauleloa, like all of these folks were integral to making sure that the story of these places, that these wahipana, are not forgotten. It is also important to, I think, I just came back from the WIPSI, with the World Indigenous Peoples Conference on Education in New Zealand, and I can tell you that the story of what Native Hawaiians are facing and confronting here in Hawaii is not lost internationally with our indigenous cousins, that they are standing in solidarity. They are ready to support and ensure that the will of this community is uplifted and resonates beyond our shores to make sure that we have support. And I will also say that it was a really meaningful reminder that these conversations are not just happening about Pōhakuloa. The implications of a condemnation threat should feel closer to home than some currently military-occupied leased land. I think we should make it akin to whatever, like, sacred place, some place that you have pilina to, imagining somebody saying, we're severing that relationship that you have with that āina. Somebody saying that you no longer have control or access or even information about what happens to the health and the destiny of that āina. That's the pilina, that's the meaning every single person, whether you are Kanaka or not, should be carrying with you in these conversations. And the aloha āina that comes with that, the grace that comes with that, the urgency that comes with that, the zeal, the passion, all of those things, bring that with you into these conversations. And we're here inviting that from all of you. And so it's the first time I'm seeing these PowerPoints and these bullets, but what I just shared with you is my mo'olelo, the reason why I'm involved in the project the way I am. And I will comment on one mention here. I am OHA's representative member on the Governor's Advisory Committee for Military Leased Lands. I will tell you that we had our first meeting yesterday from 9 to 11. It was a Zoom call. The governor was not participating in that call. He had representatives from his office participate, but he is going to make himself available as soon as possible to continue the conversation. It was an opportunity for the committee members to introduce themselves to one another, to everyone understanding why their representative voice, their organizational connections, I think bring a diverse and broad breadth kind of connection to the conversation. I think everybody was very humility-filled in acknowledging that this is a conversation that needs to be happening over and over again, and people are committed to ensuring that that happens. It was also affirmation that transparency and everything that gets discussed needs to be able to get shared with the community in reasonable time, and everyone is there sort of the anti-condemnation. Let me just get to the point. The anti-condemnation position is well represented in that advisory committee. It is the position of OHA. And so long as there is appetite and welcome reception to having that particular position continue to inform discussions, which I can say from the first meeting it was, that this may be one of many productive spaces for having conversations around military leases and the future of those leases. And so mahalo for your time and attention here, and we're going to do our best to share out information as objectively and transparently as possible. Yeah.
Okay, next slide. Thanks, Summer.
Yeah.
So, the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, real briefly. We often answer this question, what is OHA? When was OHA created? What does OHA do? OHA doesn't do anything. And we often try to attempt to answer that question what is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs? So OHA was created in 1978 via the state's constitution, the last time the state had a constitutional convention. The Hawaiian Affairs Committee created OHA along with a couple other really important things that we'll talk about later that affected Native Hawaiians. But OHA was created to be a receptacle of the pro rata share of the public land trust revenue. It is governed by 9 statewide elected trustees. I represent Hawaii Island. It manages a almost $700 million Native Hawaiian trust fund, 13th largest landowner in the state. OHA was envisioned to empower Native Hawaiians around self-determination, self-governance, and autonomy. The fact that up until 2000, only Native Hawaiians could vote in the OHA election is a form of autonomy and self-governance and self-determination. And so OHA was created to do that. It is an independent agency here in Hawaii. It is independent from the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. And it is enshrined in the state's constitution and in Chapter 10 of the Hawaii Revised Statutes. So that is the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. We have a staff of about 130 statewide. So we are going to get to the crown and government lands of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And it is important that we start there. So we are going to imagine all of us went back in time to pre or just after Western contact, the late 1700s, the early 1800s. And this by no means encompasses all the major historical events of the time, but it has some pretty key historical events. So post-Western contact, Hawaii was a standard port of call. Whaling, the sandalwood trade, European ships coming from all over the world were descending on Hawaii and really throughout the Pacific. You know, Western and European imperialism was throughout the entire Pacific. And it started in the early 1800s, and it went throughout almost up until the 1900s. Great Britain had annexed New Zealand in 1840. Fiji was ceded to Great Britain under Queen Victoria in 1874. The Tahitians were fighting the French in 1842, and eventually the French succeeded and took over Tahiti and took over the Marquesas. Germany claimed New Guinea and parts of Samoa. And so throughout the entire 1800s, foreign nations were spread out throughout all of the Pacific, colonizing smaller islands and smaller countries. That is a reality. But the crown jewel was Hawaii. That was the crown jewel. And up until the late 1800s, no single Western or European nation had taken a major foothold in the Hawaiian Islands. But that was the crown jewel. And so, back one slide. Yeah, okay, so 1810, Kamehameha unites the Hawaiian Islands, right? Prior to that, there were different chiefdoms on different islands, different elite. Everyone different islands would fight each other, and eventually Kamehameha united the Hawaiian Islands. In 1817, Kamehameha passes, and just a few years later, the arrival of Calvinists and Protestant missionaries arrive in the Hawaiian Islands. And they bring with them, you know, Western culture, education, religion, a different belief set in how people view the world. Can you ask them to close that door, please? Thank you. So, after Kamehameha passes, you have Kamehameha II, Liho, and then you have Kamehameha III, and that's a really important moment in the monarchy at the time, because up until then, you didn't have a constitutional monarchy. You had a different form of government, but in 1840, Kauikeaʻuli establishes the Hawaiian Kingdom, and that is the first time that power was shared between the mo'i and a legislature elected by the people. It expanded political rights for the maka āina nā. It gave them a voice. But in the kingdom during that time, Western influence was heavy. European influence was heavy. And so foreign advisors, even from 1840, when the first constitution was promulgated, was pushing for private land ownership to align Western property concepts. Because prior to that, there was no concept of private land ownership in Hawaii. It basically existed from King Kamehameha II, until the Constitution was done by Kamehameha III. 1848 is a big date in Hawaii because that is the Great Mahele. And the Great Mahele is when Kamehameha III divided lands throughout the Hawaiian Islands. There's about 4.5 million acres of land throughout the entire Hawaiian Islands today, the main Hawaiian Islands. But Kamehameha III, through the Great Mahele, divides those lands, and he is the first to be able to choose the lands that he reserves for himself. And he chooses about 2.5 million acres of land. And almost immediately after that, he separates those two lands. 984,000 acres are designated as the crown lands. 1.5 million acres become lands of the government of the Kingdom of Hawaii. And the intent was to transition toward legally recognized land titles. But that's what the Mahele does. It creates the crown and the government lands. It apportions lands to the ali'i, and it also gives a little bit of land to the maka āina. Now, the Kuleana Act that would come 2 years later would attempt to address that. But the origins of the crown lands begin with Kamehameha III. And that is going to be really important because that still affects us today. So 984,000 acres were the crown lands of Kāwili St. In 1850, and let's see, anything else here? Okay, 1850 is the Kuleana Act. The Kuleana Act allowed maka āina nā, or the commoners, to file land claims for lands that they were cultivating at the time and give them an additional acre for home ownership. That was in 1850. But because the process was tough, it was burdensome, far fewer Kuleana parcels were awarded than the kingdom had hoped for. But that was the Kuleana Act. And there are Kanaka today that still have Kuleana lands. And there are also special laws that are enacted by the counties that relate to Kuleana lands and taxes and things like that. But that was really important as well in 1850. Also in 1850 was something that is not on the slide but is and should be noted. And this was the Alien Land Ownership Act that was passed by the kingdom's legislature at the time. And it was started to put into the process of allowing foreigners to own land in Hawaii for the first time. This would eventually open the door for rapid American and European settlers that would arrive in the Hawaiian Islands and wanted land for various different purposes. In 1864, the crown and government lands through the Constitution is legally there's the reaffirmation of the legal separation between the crown and government lands take place. This strengthens the protections preventing their outright sale, and it confirmed that the crown lands would pass to the next mo'i. And this is important because this comes back in 1910 when Liliuokalani sues the United States for her lands that were confiscated at the overthrow. So that's the 1864 Constitution that reaffirmed the legal separation between the crown lands of Kāwili St. and the government lands of the Kingdom of Hawaii. In 1865, the crown lands are made inalienable. What does that mean? It means they can't be sold. Those 984,000 acres, by now Kamehameha III has passed. Kamehameha IV and soon to be Kamehameha V are rising to power. They were the direct descendants of Kamehameha. And what the the law that made the crown lands were declared inalienable in 1865, they paid off debt from Kamehameha IV. The crown lands were deemed inalienable, which they could not be sold by the monarch. Leases were limited to no more than 30 years. And lands were designated that they would descend to their heirs and their successors of the Hawaiian crown forever. So by 1865, the crown lands are declared inalienable. You cannot sell them, almost 1 million acres, and that they would be passed to the successor mo'is after the current mo'i would pass. In 1872, Lunalilo is now elected, and he was elected by plebiscite. He was a half-brother of he was a descendant of one of the half-brothers of Kamehameha. But the Kamehameha line effectively stopped with Lunalilo. He was the first elected monarch by plebiscite, and he's he is the first monarch that starts to have early conversations about ceding Pu'uloa or the Pearl River to the United States military. He offers that up in 1872, and part of that would be reciprocity with the United States. And that is met with such fierce opposition throughout the Hawaiian Islands that he pulls back from that. But every ali'i during that time, even Bernice Pauahi herself, opposed the secession of the Pearl River or Pu'uloa, or what is today Pearl Harbor, to the United States military. But that is important because that's the first time that really we can see when the United States is trying to establish a military position or a stronghold in the Pacific. In 1874, Kalakaua is elected, and there's a big election in the state between Queen Emma and Kalakaua. Ultimately, Kalakaua is elected. He had aligned himself with American interests at the time, and part of that was there was a lot of talk about reciprocity. You know, during that time, sugar plantations or plantation agriculture was taking a major foothold in Hawaii. And so American interests supported Kalakaua's election. Ultimately, Kalakaua was elected. Kalakaua is also credited with supporting and reviving the cultural traditions of Hawaiian identity. We honor him today with the Merry Monarch Hula Festival. In 1875, the Reciprocity Treaty happens, and this opens U.S. markets to Hawaiian sugar without tariffs. This was a big deal because it sparked a huge economic boom in Hawaii. It led to rapid expansion of plantations, from 20 plantations to 63 plantations in less than 5 years. And over the course of the next 60 years, almost 400,000 contract laborers would be brought into Hawaii from Portugal and from China and Japan and the Philippines to work on the plantations. And obviously this changed dramatically the character of the Hawaiian Islands at the time. But in the Reciprocity Treaty, that did not include the cession of Pearl Harbor to the United States military, but it did intensify foreign interest in the Crown lands. Because if you remember, the Crown lands were inalienable in 1865. Kalakaua could not sell those lands, even though foreign interests wanted those lands because they were some of the best lands for plantations, the best lands for agriculture. And so increased U.S. influence was occurring in the 1875 Reciprocity Treaty. In 1887 is the Bayonet Constitution, and by now you have Sanford Dole, Lauren Thurston, you have Castle, you have the Hawaiian League, and Kalakaua is forced at gunpoint to sign the Bayonet Constitution. And this was huge because it shifted power from the monarchy to the legislature. It created a House of Nobles that was elected rather than appointed. It enforced property, income, and literacy requirements in the kingdom. So if you couldn't read or you didn't own property or you didn't have wealth, you couldn't vote in the elections. It was disenfranchising Native Hawaiians from participating in the electoral process, and it dramatically reduced Native Hawaiian political power. It empowered militias like the Honolulu Rifles that would eventually come back in 1893 to support the overthrow. And they were aligned with the Hawaiian League that was led by Sanford Dole and Lauren Thurston, architects of the Committee of Safety who would eventually overthrow the Hawaiian Kingdom. The Bayonet Constitution abrogated the 1865 Constitution, and it undermined royal authority. It also imposed voting restrictions, favoring Europeans and Americans over native subjects. Shortly after the Bayonet Constitution, a supplemental treaty happened that added Pearl Harbor to the mix. And this is the first time that the United States was allowed through a supplemental treaty, the Treaty of Reciprocity, where they could start to establish a coaling station and a repair station for the United States military, specifically the Navy, at Pu'uloa, at Pearl Harbor, and that was in 1887. Liliuokalani becomes queen in 1891, and she attempts to shift power back to the monarchy. That is her goal, is to bring power back to the monarch, to promulgate a new constitution. There is a lot happening in the kingdom in the late 1880s of the 1800s and the early 1890s. And it culminates with the overthrow of the Hawaiian Kingdom and the overthrow of Queen Liliuokalani in 1891. And obviously that is a watershed moment in the kingdom. It destabilizes the kingdom. It led to the overthrow. And that was supported by the U.S. Foreign Minister, Stevens, that was in the Hawaiian Islands at the time, supported by the United States Marines who landed in Honolulu, and supported the Committee of Safety that overthrew the Queen. And by the end of the day, on January 17, 1893, the Minister Stevens recognized the provisional government and the ending of the Hawaiian Kingdom. And that would later come back and that happened in the Harrison presidency. Shortly after, you had the Cleveland presidency, where he sends Blount to come to Hawaii to do an investigation. And they determined that, yes, the United States wrongfully overthrew and supported these individuals that overthrew the Queen and established the provisional government. And that happens in 1893. Summer, you want to add anything up until that point in the historical timeline leading us to the overthrow?
No, you did a comprehensive thing. I just keep in mind, I think this is the story, this is the genealogy of the lands that are the subject of these military lease extensions. And this is the history that we think everyone should be armed with when entering into conversations about why condemnation is so vile in terms of an option, and why every single person who now calls Hawaii home should have a stakeholder interest in ensuring that those lands are treated with that kind of historical recognition.
So on that day, when Liliuokalani, to prevent further bloodshed of her people, stands down with the intent that she would bring her complaint to the United States and have her kingdom restored. That was the goal. But when the provisional government overthrows the kingdom, they take and illegally confiscate what exists during that time, which is the kingdom government lands and the crown lands of the monarchy of Liliuokalani. Those two lands is what along with other lands, is what the provisional government takes. The provisional government immediately starts to push for annexation, and they run into trouble because there's President Cleveland, who was against annexation and against the overthrow and wanted to find out what happened, sends Blount to the Hawaiian Islands to do their investigation. There's a lot of differing opinions in the United States Congress during that time. Depends on who was in charge. But what is clear is that the provisional government, led by Dole and Thurston and others, are not able to convince the United States Congress at that point to annex Hawaii. And as we all know, 2 times a treaty of annexation was failed to get ratification in the United States Senate. So the provisional government decides a year later to create the Republic of Hawaii, and they do so in 1894. they established the Constitution of the Republic of Hawaii in 1894, and in Article 95 of that Constitution, they formally take the Crown lands. At the time, estimated to be 971,463. Remember, it was originally 988,000, but then part of that land act was paying off Kamehameha IV's debt, and whatever was left was now inalienable. So at the Republic of Hawaii's Constitution that was established, there's 971,463 acres of Crown lands taken by the Republic of Hawaii. A year later, in 1895, this is something that Stanford Dole had been trying to do for 20 years, and that was to merge the Crown and government lands and make them able to be purchased by foreign ownership. Make them take away the inalienability that was established, and they accomplished that in 1895, in the 1895 Land Act. So the merger of the Crown and government lands. RHRSs still refer to the 1895 Land Act. It still exists in our Hawaii Revised Statutes because that's an important date and an important distinction for the Crown and government lands. In 1898, annexation happens, where 1.8 million acres are ceded to the United States. And there's two follow-on slides after that. So I'm going to stop there, and then we'll come back. Let's go to the next slide. Okay. So the Kingdom of Hawaii, or the Republic of Hawaii, is, after two failed treaties of annexation, the House of Representatives passed the Newlands Resolution. The Newlands Resolution was made to model over similar congressional legislation that allowed the state of Texas to become a state. But it was totally different than what was done for the state of Texas. But the Newlands Resolution is signed into law on July 7, 1898. And there's a really important piece in the Newlands Resolution. Not only does it result in the secession of Hawaiian sovereignty and the conveyance of 1.8 million acres of government and crown lands to the United States, but in that one act, Hawaii becomes an unincorporated territory, meaning we were never guaranteed for statehood. So the Hawaiian Islands fell under the United States, under its U.S. sovereignty, but it was never fully part of the United States. So legally, a U.S. territory is a legal status that the United States can convey to another country. But functionally, Hawaii functioned as a colony from 1898 on through the 1900s. We had no voter representation in Congress, no ability to choose its own head of state. That was done by the President of the United States. U.S. officials exercised complete control over the government. And Native Hawaiians, as we know from the Kauai petition, did not consent to annexation or the overthrow. And existing laws of the United States. Now, what is really important about the Newlands Resolution is Congress is having these discussions throughout 1893, 1894, 5, 6, 7, 8. And they realize that the confiscation of those lands at the overthrow, bringing the government and crown lands together in 1895, that there's a major issue out there in Hawaii. And so when they take the Hawaiian Islands as a unincorporated territory through the Newlands Resolution, they specifically highlight the public lands in the Newlands Resolution. And they explicitly say that these lands that are being ceded to the United States, 1.8 million acres, do not fall under the same lands that existed in the United States during that time as federal lands. That the Congress would have to enact a special law for these lands because they realize the significance of these lands to the Hawaiian Kingdom, the inhabitants of the people of Hawaii at the time, which majority were Native Hawaiians. And so if you go to the next slide, here's the Newlands Resolution. Third paragraph. The existing laws of the United States relative to public lands shall not apply to such lands in the Hawaiian Islands. But the Congress of the United States shall enact special laws for their management and disposition, provided that all revenue from or proceeds of the same, except as regards, may be used for, or occupied for the civil, military, or naval purpose of the United States, shall be used solely for the benefit of the inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands for educational and other public purposes. This is the start of the Public Lands Trust in the Newlands Resolution. They realized the importance of the government and crown lands, that they were taken from the Kingdom of Hawaii, of which we had over 20 treaties with foreign nations, including the United States, Great Britain, France, and Germany, amongst many others. That these lands were taken, they were ceded to the United States, and they were special. And they should be held in a trust. So this is the start of the Public Lands Trust. It is in the Newlands Resolution. Go back 2 slides. So 2 years later, the Organic Act is passed by Congress. The Organic Act creates the territorial government of the time. And the Organic Act, if I think I have the next slide. So territorial governance and next slide. Okay, here's the Organic Act. So Organic Act is established on April 30th, 1900. It formally establishes Hawaii's territorial government under U.S. law. The President of the United States appoints the territorial governor, the secretary, and the judicial branch. So the president from 1900 to 1959 except during martial law, during World War II, appointed the governor, appointed the secretary, who would take the place of the governor if the governor was incapacitated, appointed the territorial Supreme Court, the Circuit Court, the Federal District Court. Now, in the Organic Act, Section 73 specifically provided, and this is language that is in quotes, it provided that any sale, lease, or disposition of the ceded lands, so they're already calling them ceded, right? Ceded at annexation, would be for such purposes, uses and purposes for the benefit of the inhabitants of the territory of Hawaii, as are consistent with the joint resolution of annexation. So in the Organic Act, the Public Land Trust continues. They acknowledge the ceded lands, the crown and government lands, and they specifically say that these lands are for the benefit of the inhabitants of the territory of Hawaii, as are consistent with the joint resolution of annexation, which is the Newlands Resolution. The federal government also, though, in the Organic Act, reserved the right to withdraw lands for its own use, and it would do so. Hundreds of thousands of acres were taken out of what would be the ceded lands, would be considered the ceded lands, largely for national parks, for the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, and also to establish military bases and footholds throughout the Hawaiian Islands. The Organic Act also assigned a non-voting delegate to Congress. We don't need to go back to the next slide, but in 1908, remember, through the supplemental treaty in the Bayonet Constitution, the United States can start to establish a foothold, a coaling and repair station at Pu'uloa by 1908. It's a major military construction project, and Pearl Harbor is effectively, taken over by the United States military and the Navy, and they're building a major deepwater harbor and a major port for U.S. naval vessels and assets at Pearl Harbor. So that's 1908.
The one historical footnote I will note and point out is that while the joint resolution and the people who supported it believe that it effectuated a cessation of sovereignty, we know that the 1993 apology resolution affirms that our sovereignty was unrelinquished. So I want to make sure that our sharing with you of this historical perspective and the documentation is, like, as we continue discussing future legislation, that historical footnote is important, and it's not lost on us that is an inaccurate fallacy. Okay?
Absolutely. We bring up the apology resolution in 1993, but what is important to take from here is the crown and government lands were unique. They were special. They were unrelinquished by the inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands, the majority of which were Native Hawaiians. They were recognized by the United States Congress in the Newlands Resolution and the Organic Act as being lands that were special current U.S. laws would not apply to them, special laws would be made for them, and they would be made for the benefit of the inhabitants of the Hawaiian Islands. And this would come back in 1959 in the Public Land Trust, and we'll go over that in a second. Next slide. 1910, Liliuokalani versus the United States. So Queen Liliuokalani is 7 years before she passes in 1917. She is older. The overthrow had already been almost 20 years, 17 years to be exact. And she sues the United States to get her crown lands back. And there's a big, judicial battle over that. But ultimately, it is ruled that Liliuokalani's lands were lands that were part of the crown. And when the crown and the kingdom was overthrown, those lands were then taken by the provisional government, what would become the Republic of Hawaii. So that's like her last stand for the crown lands, and she is not successful. But that is important to note, Liliuokalani versus the United States. In 1920, the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act is created through Prince Kuhio for homesteading, and it establishes a trust for Native Hawaiians. From the 1.8 million acres of land that was ceded at annexation, 203,000-ish come out to form the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act land trust, and that's set aside in 1920. And then we jump to the Admissions Act of 1959. You know, in the late 40s, in the late 50s, from what we can see, there was a big push and support from Native Hawaiians at the time for statehood. The territorial legislature at the time, with many notable names at the time, were pursuing statehood. But you got to also realize, by 1950, Native Hawaiians were strangers in their own homeland. Our language was abolished in 1896. You know, Hawaiian culture was practically non-existent. Olelo Hawaii was non-existent. And Hawaiians at the time were basically trying to survive in their own homeland. And so you have efforts to advance statehood in the early 1950s, and it finally comes to pass in 1959 with the Admissions Act. But between 1900 and the Organic Act and 1959, 200,000 acres are taken out of those ceded lands for the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. 200,000 plus acres are taken out to create the national parks. A couple more 100,000 acres are taken out to create military installations, whether it's Hickam Air Force Base or Kaneohe Marine Corps Base or bases all over the Hawaiian Islands. And so a significant amount of lands are taken out of the ceded lands corpus. That was the merging of the government and the crown lands in 1895. But we jump to the Admissions Act. And the Admissions Act is really important, and I'm going to pull it up right now, and maybe Summer can start to preview the Admissions Act. Signed August 21st, 1959. There is, and what you'll notice is on the right side, some of Delegate Burns, who would eventually become Governor Burns, key aspects of the Admissions Act. I'm going to go to Section 4 of the Admissions Act just to highlight it. Because really the United States had not done much for the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act between 1920, 1921, and 1959, they conditioned statehood that the new state would have to take over the responsibility of the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, even though the United States still reserved the right to accept or not accept changes that the state would want to make to the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act. So they require the adoption and the responsibility of the new state in Section 4 of the Admissions Act. And this is it right here. But what is most important, this is the nucleus of the Admissions Act and how it relates to this conversation and this issue. And that is Section 5. And there's several subsections of Section 5 of the Admissions Act. And they still apply today. Section 5 is the land piece. And the overall conversation that we are having is tied to land, is tied to power, is tied to greed, is tied to money. And Section 5 of the Admissions Act describes how land would be treated in the Hawaiian Islands with the new state. So I'm going to walk you through it. Summer and I will walk you through it. So title to property, right? The state of Hawaii and its political subdivisions shall succeed to the title of the territory of Hawaii and its subdivisions in those lands and other properties in which the territory and its subdivisions now hold title. So the new state would take over title for these lands. Section B is a land grant section, and Summer, if you can see and help me with the next subsequent sections, these are really important. So the United States grants to the state of Hawaii, effective upon its admission to the Union, the United States title to all the public lands and other public property within the boundaries of the state of Hawaii, to which title is held by the United States immediately prior to its admission into the Union. So the United States is transferring the land to the new state of Hawaii. Everything that the United States held immediately prior to the admission of the Union in Hawaii into the Union. Section C is an important part of the Admissions Act because it says any land and other properties that on the date Hawaii is admitted into the Union are set aside pursuant to law for the use of the United States under any 1 act of Congress, 2 executive order, 3 proclamation of the President, 4 proclamation of the Governor, shall remain the property of the United States, only to the limitations, if any, imposed under. And so this is important because it sets aside lands.
Yeah, 287,000 acres. 287,000 acres of land, yeah.
Set aside.
Correct.
Okay. And they would be set aside for the national parks, military bases. This is where the United States is saying, hey, we're giving you back these lands, but we are reserving what we want, and we can do that through an act of Congress, an executive order, proclamation of the President, or the Governor of Hawaii.
Yeah, and so that everybody understands the breadth and the details of that, it's 287,078 acres total. Of that, 227,972 acres are national parks, understood would remain in federal land holding, and 59,196 acres are at issue for return under 5E, which we'll discuss a little later. But that's the breakdown of the land holding that falls under that particular provision.
The next is any public lands or other public property that is conveyed to the state of Hawaii by subsection B of this section immediately prior to the admission of said state into the Union is controlled by the United States pursuant to permit, license, or permission from the territory of Hawaii, giving it 5 years following the admission of Hawaii into the Union, can be set aside by act of Congress or by executive order of the President made pursuant to law. So anything that the United States, on the day of admission into the Union, held by permit, license, or permission, would be, the United States would have 5 years to retain those lands to the day, August 21st, 1964. Section E would also set a 5-year limit, where from the date Hawaii is admitted into the Union, federal agencies would have control over any land or property that is retained by the United States. And so Section E is also another 5-year provision that is incorporated into the Admissions Act. This would eventually, what our delegation and our leaders in Hawaii wanted was they wanted as much lands returned to the new state of Hawaii as possible. But what Section 5E said, and this goes to the land back conversation, is that after 5 years, we don't need to give you any land back. That would be fixed in December of 1963 with a public law that still exists to today that allows the federal government, even to today, to return lands that are excess lands, that are not being used by the United States, and return them to the state of Hawaii. And so Section E was fixed in a public law that was passed in December of 1963.
And to provide, again, detail or understanding of the breadth of what's at stake, it's 145,747 acres, potentially land back.
Could be land back.
Correct.
Yeah. Okay, finally, the most important part of Section 5 is Section 5F. 5F goes with 5B. 5B are the lands that were given back to the state. 5F is what expands the Newlands Resolution. It expands the Organic Act to create the Public Land Trust. The lands of Pōhakuloa, of Makua, and many other lands throughout the Hawaiian Islands that are part of the Public Land Trust are tied to this. This is where the Public Land Trust doctrine comes in. And Section 5F says that the lands granted to the state of Hawaii by subsection B of this section and public lands retained by the United States will be held in trust for the support of the public schools and other public educational institutions, for the betterment of the conditions of Native Hawaiians as defined in the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, as amended, for the development of farm and home ownership on as widespread a basis as possible, and for the making of public improvements and for the provision of lands for public use. That is the Public Land Trust. Congress only intended the Public Land Trust to benefit Native Hawaiians, small n. That's you see this right here? That's the small n. When people refer to small n, big N, that's it. It never intended for proceeds from the Public Land Trust to support Native Hawaiians that were not 50% blood quantum or greater. That would be fixed later at the state level through the Office of Hawaiian Affairs at the Constitutional Convention. But through the Admissions Act from 1959, this was the public trust purposes, the 5 public trust purposes. So it includes Native Hawaiians, and it also includes members of the general public. Anything else, Summer, on the Public Land Trust? No. Okay. I want to show you something because it is important, and I think it can put Section 5D and the 5-year limit for leasing into perspective and make it easier to understand. So I know we're going to jump to this later, but I want to show you this right now. This is the map of Pōhakuloa. And there are critical pieces of information on here. Notably, this one. Presidential Executive Order 11167. For those of you with ChatGPT, you can just type that in right now. It was executed by President Lyndon Johnson with the authority of Section 5D of the Admissions Act. Remember the 5 years that 5D created? President Johnson exercised 5D 2 days before the deadline to convey 85,000 acres of land from the Public Land Trust into fee simple ownership by the United States. And today, this land here is the impact area. At Pōhakuloa, the base of Mauna Loa is here. So this is where 5D comes in. And if you just use AI and type in Presidential Executive Order 11167, you will see in the first 3 paragraphs 5D of the Admissions Act and the authority placed here. This would also come into other portions of the Admissions Act are noted here as well. The base and the cantonment area conveyed before the Admissions Act by territorial governor executive order. The lease of the state leased lands executed 5 days before the deadline on 21 August 1964, and that is why this lease expires on 16 August 2029, because 65 years ago, it was executed on 16 August 1964. But this is where major provisions of the Admissions Act come into play. And I think one of the most important things is that the public land trust is the crown and government lands of the Kingdom of Hawaii. They were established by Kāwili. They were the crown lands that were meant to support the kingdom. They were illegally confiscated at the overthrow. They were conveyed to the new republic and eventually the United States, held in public trust via the Newlands Resolution, the Organic Act, and eventually the Admissions Act that created the state of Hawaii. And this exists in our state's constitution today. This will come back in the apology resolution, in numerous court cases. And some would even argue that these lands that form the public land trust, that the new state holds paper titles to those lands. Because really, the state is a fiduciary. It is a trustee for the public land trust. All of us, OHA, the executive branch, the legislative branch, are trustees for the public land trust. Summer, anything else on this?
No.
Okay.
Maybe, is there any, you want to take any questions?
Nope.
Okay. Okay, we'll save those for later.
Yep. Let's go back one slide.
Okay.
1963 is an important law, and I talked about the worry that the congressional delegation had at the time, specifically people like Senator Inouye and others, that 5E of the Admissions Act would prevent the land back of any federal lands to be returned to the state if they were in excess. Public Law 88-233 still is used today because this law allows the United States to return excess federal lands to the state of Hawaii. It is a foundational statute that exists for land exchanges, conveyances, and settlement discussions. Anything on that, public law?
I will say that in the same way that the 1993 apology resolution is commonplace, we carry that with us. That's our understanding of our unrelinquished sovereignty affirmed by Congress in the United States. I think we need to start committing Public Law 88-233 to that same kind of understanding, commonplace, like language, because that is our land back. That is our land back provision.
This is a letter from Senator Inouye. He's a brand new United States Senator in 1963 that I found in the Congressional Archives at Hamilton Library to President Kennedy. They are dealing with the same issues pursuant to Section 5D of the Statehood Act. I'm going to jump to important parts. 65-year long-term leases. And let me read this in Senator Inouye's own words. It is certainly not the intention of the state of Hawaii to deprive the military of the legitimate use of needed maneuver areas for so long as and to the extent that they are needed. However, in view of certain factors which should be taken into consideration, I do not think either advisable or fair for the military to insist on either an artificial deadline or inequitable terms in any lease or set-aside order. Doesn't that sound like today? In the first place, the maneuver areas are not used year-round. Some have considerable value to the people of Hawaii for recreation, including hunting, hiking, camping, swimming. The area of our state is extremely limited, particularly on Oahu, where we have over 960 persons per square mile. It makes good sense to try to accommodate a number of different uses for the same land area. For example, it makes good sense to arrange for public use of certain parts of Pōhakuloa and the maneuver areas for hunting and hiking. He talks about Maili and Makua. just because the military might want to practice an occasional small-scale landing. In the second place, I understand the military is asking for a 65-year term in the leases or face the alternative of an indefinite set-aside order. What does set-aside order sound like to you? Today's version of condemnation. Set-aside was written into the Admissions Act. It allowed the United States to set aside lands that it wanted. That was in 5D. 5C, 5D, a little bit of 5E. It may be possible to project the need for hardened developed installations like Pearl Harbor, Scorfield, or Hickam 65 years into the future, but it is difficult to make the same claim about these maneuver areas. Common sense, if nothing else, indicates the type of equipment, troop deployments, and training needs are likely to vary tremendously in the next half century. If leases for these areas are entered into terms of 10 or 20 years, with certain options to renew, there might be more in order. So he's expressing his concern about the military forcing 65-year leases on the state, or we're just going to set it aside by August 21st, 1964, and there's nothing you can do about it. Kind of sounds like the challenges we're having today. And then he talks about, in the third place, this legislation that is Public Law 88-233. He wrote this letter on November 18, 1963. 88-233 was passed December 1963. This letter is on our website, and in the own words of Senator Inouye, who is struggling to find a solution along with other members of the congressional delegation at the time. But in 1964, the military decides, for whatever reason, which is really interesting, because they could have decided to set aside the pink lands. They already had the base and what they call the cantonment area, because that was conveyed via territorial executive order by the governor at the time. They conveyed via President Johnson's executive order the 84,000 acres that is the impact area, but for some reason, they decided not to set aside by this deadline these lands. So these lands were leased. It's the same date of Makua, very similar dates with the Pacific Missile Range facility at Barking Sands. But these lands are, and these leases are executed across Hawaii. So major long-term leases are signed, and executive orders are used to set aside additional lands for military purposes. And all this is happening in late 1963 and early 1964, because there is a mad dash to the August 21st, 1964 deadline. And we are living with those choices today. We are facing the same challenges that they faced back then. So you get through 1964, we get into the 70s. There's a really important Supreme Court case that affirms the state's fiduciary duty over the public land trust. It's called State versus Zimmering, and it's really the first time when the state, so this is a lawsuit because of new lava that had been created down in the Puna area of Hawaii Island. And there was a lawsuit on, okay, who owns this new land? Who owns the accreted land? If the lava covers my property, do I still own the property? Whose land is it? And it was a really important case because the court ruled that land created by lava flows is accreted land. It is not the property of the private landowner whose parcel was covered, and the state as a sovereign holds title to lava-created land. But the most significant part of the case was when the court explicitly stated that the state, that the newly created lava land is now land of the public land trust. And that the court explicitly stated that the state holds these lands in trust, pursuant to the Admissions Act of 1959, 5F, the 5 public trust purposes, which conveyed all former government and crown lands from the United States to the state as a public trust to support the people of Hawaii. This was a foundational precedent-setting Supreme Court decision because it defined the scope of the ceded lands trust, and it would define really the role of the state of Hawaii as a trustee for the benefit of the people of Hawaii through the Crown and government lands. And that is exactly a quote from State versus Zimring, that the state holds the public lands, formerly the Crown and government lands of the kingdom, as a trustee for the benefit of the people of Hawaii. So the former Crown and government lands are trust lands. The state is a trustee. Native Hawaiians and the general public are beneficiaries of that trust, and that the state must administer these lands consistent with public trust principles. And that is really important. Anything on that? No. From your legal mind? Okay, so 1978, we have the Constitutional Convention. There's a couple really important things that happened in 1978. The state's water code is created. Olelo Hawaii is recognized as the state's language. The Department of Education is required to teach Hawaiian culture and public education in a Hawaiian-based focused education, which would eventually become the Kula Kaiopunis. The customary, traditional practices and gathering rights are enshrined in the state's constitution, and the Office of Hawaiian Affairs is established. And it is established because from 59 to 78, nothing had been done to provide for that one public trust purpose, the benefit of Native Hawaiians as defined by the Hawaiian Homes Commission Act, from the revenues generated that the state was holding to meet the requirements of the public land trust. Most of the revenues went to the Department of Education. And so OHA is created to be a receptacle for those revenues. It expands the public trust at the state level, at least, by including all Native Hawaiians. And that goes before the state legislature in 1979 that creates Hawaii Revised Statutes Chapter 10. First OHA trustees are seated in 1980, and OHA starts to receive revenues from the public land trust. That has been a fight since 1979. We still don't have a complete, accurate public land trust inventory. But today, OHA receives $21.5 million from the state of Hawaii in public land trust revenues. These are lands that are leased, that generate revenue, that are held by multiple state agencies. I'll give you one example. Banyan Drive, Hilo Hawaiian. The lease for Hilo Hawaiian that gets paid to the Department of Land and Natural Resources, OHA receives theoretically 20% of that general lease for the Hilo Hawaiian Hotel. The Kanoilehua industrial area, ceded lands. All the revenues generated on those lands, OHA receives a pro rata share or a 20% pro rata portion of those lands. And that is the case all over the state. And that has gone through multiple court proceedings and different rulings and whatnot. But that is where we stand today with that. Next slide. 1980 establishes a 20% revenue model through Act 273. So OHA now has a direct interest in the public land trust, because through the Admissions Act and through the state's constitution, OHA has a fiduciary responsibility to fight and protect and steward the public land trust, which we know is part of, going all the way back to 1840, the royal lands of Kāwili that he set aside at the Great Mahele. 1990, obviously Kaho'olawe is a major part of this conversation starting in the 1970s. We do note it on our slide because of the military training and impacts that had happened to Kaho'olawe through the years. We have another slide dedicated to that. But the President of the United States at the time, George H.W. Bush, issues a memorandum to the Secretary of Defense effectively ending live fire training at Kaho'olawe or any live fire bombing in 1990. Then you have the Apology Resolution in 1993. Some of you want to touch on that. And the big highlight in that, probably the unrelinquishing of the lands.
And the unrelinquished sovereignty, right? Like that is an affirmation that the overthrow was illegal, that there is an obligation for reconciliation that the federal government must move towards, make progress on. And I think it's also just an affirmation of our own collective history, the history that we didn't need the federal government to affirm, to understand, to live, but it helps it helps move these conversations forward.
2003, Kaho'olawe is returned to the state under a stewardship model. Approximately today, federal lands that are retained by the United States total 370,000 acres. This is approximate, of which about 220,000 acres are the national parks. Really, the majority of the rest of the lands are military lands. As an example, the almost 90,000 acres in the impact area at Pōhakuloa, like that's part of the 370,000 acres that the federal lands retain. Next.
Okay, I will say that we are on slide 13.
Yep.
And they're 32.
Yep. We're all, yep.
715.
Yep.
Okay.
Next. Hey, like I said, there's a lot of information, and you're going to get all of it. So, regional examples of military impact, Kaho'olawe. And Summer and I can go back and forth between these slides. Summer, why don't you take this one, Kaho'olawe.
So, Kia'i, I mean, the short story is, like, they were presented with a moment like this one. Activists, aloha āina stewards, ensured that these lands would not be live-fired training, bombing on compelled, that kind of activism compelled lawmakers and federal decision makers to ensure that there was a response that allowed for the return of these lands. They are currently still held by the state, but they are promised to OHA or to the governance, to the kingdom, or reconciliation, when Native Hawaiians establish their own governance structure. And what is also important is that these lands still have degradation, that is the money that was allotted to remediate them is inadequate. And so the valuation of remediation after the fact, the inability to clean up UXOs and bombs and artillery that's left over is a very difficult proposition. And so when we talk about Pōhakuloa and any other land used for this kind of live fire training, we need to ensure that there is a sufficient budget, that there is sufficient studies, that there are sufficient environmental impacts being done, ideally simultaneously and not after the fact, because that valuation process becomes difficult. And Kaho'olawe, while that is a return of land that is promising, it's a return of land in a condition that is still unsafe to traverse, let alone inhabit. And that kind of standard is not the standard that we want repeated. Kaho'olawe is the instructive example of what we don't want repeated when it comes to Pōhakuloa, when it comes to Makua, and any other of the lands that are subject.
Yeah, we have three. We cover Kaho'olawe. We got Makua Valley. Obviously, that's another one. There's about 700, little over 700 acres at Makua Valley that are state leased lands. Another 3,000 acres are federal lands. They were seized by the United States military during World War II. People that lived there were forcibly removed from those lands. They were promised that they would be able to return. They never were given that chance to return. It's been turned into a long-term military reservation. It's caused significant environmental degradation, cultural site damage, disruption to Native Hawaiian access. There was a 2001 settlement that required the Army to conduct a full EIS. The reality is that there isn't live fire training and hasn't been in Makua Valley since about 2004, in the early 2000s. But those that stood up and fought for Makua Valley are largely credited with the Malama Makua Ohana and movement. And today they still do cultural access there. But there's numerous lingering environmental hazards and contamination issues in Makua Valley today. Next slide. Pōhakuloa, the center of Moko Keawe. It's a very powerful and energetically sacred place. It is one of very unique places in the Hawaiian Islands that has multiple climates, multiple ecosystems, 26 species, both plant and animal, that can be found nowhere else in the world. And so it's a very, very special place. It is one of the most largest and widely used training areas in the Indo-Pacific. It's not just used by primarily the United States Army, but it's also a joint multinational and coalition forces training installation. It's one of the only places besides Kāula that supports live fire exercises of various different types of training, whether it's ground maneuvers, unmanned aircraft operations, strategic airdrop, or combined arms maneuvers for combat readiness. Maybe Summer, speak really quickly to Ching versus Case.
As stated earlier, affirmative, proactive, can't sit on your trustee duties and or delegate those duties to the lessee. You need to affirmatively steward these lands, steward the lands that are entrusted to you. This set the standard for how the state, because it was a state court decision, has to be a good steward, has to enforce its lease provisions, has to require the kind of cleanup, the kind of inspection, the kind of inventorying that we want to see happen everywhere else that feds have.
And I think why Ching versus Case is important, and why this larger conversation is important, and just to orient ourselves looking at this map. This is an important map. Mauna Kea and the Science Reserve is here. This is where the base is. Most people don't know the land use there or who controls what, but the federal government controls the base. It controls Bradshaw Army Airfield. Here's the old Saddle Road. Here's the new Saddle Road that goes just to the north of the base. So that is federal land that the United States owns in fee. It also has the impact area that was conveyed by President Johnson via executive order. The federal government purchased from Parker Ranch in 2006 about 24,000 acres. The DKI highway, as you go down to the bottom of the intersection here, that runs just to the edge of what they call the Keamuku parcel, or 24,000 acres. But the pink area is the state leased lands. And why the state leased lands are so important is these are largely the lands where the live fire training and the weapons that the military uses are launched from, are used from. And why this area is important to stay under state leased land is if it wasn't under state leased land, Ching Case means nothing, right?
The Ching Case still sets a precedent.
It sets a precedent.
But what he's saying effectually is that if these are federal lands, this case does not apply to federally held lands. It applies to state-held lands that are leased out to the feds. So the other reason why Ching is so important, it says, because even if the feds are bad actors, if you, state government, are leasing lands to the feds for their use, their access, their degradation, you have to be a good actor. You cannot join the bad actor. You have to proactively do something higher in terms of your fiduciary duty. But if these laws apply only to our state-owned, state-controlled lands, and it doesn't apply to federal.
That's the point I'm trying to make, is these lands are managed by the Department of Land and Natural Resources Land Division, right? They manage the lease. DLNR is responsible. That is what Ching Case was, that the state, by the judiciary, DLNR was determined to basically breach or fail to meet the terms of the lease in holding the lessee responsible for the protection and the cultural, biological, environmental.
And the fulfillment of the lease terms. The lease itself spoke to these kinds of protections, and the state wasn't enforcing it.
If these lands become federal lands, we will have no say over what happens there, ever. Today, there is cultural access that happens, largely credited to a previous base commander, J.R. Borsey, that established cultural access and allowed or started to develop a relationship where practitioners could go onto the base during the makahiki or at different times, right? Part of that is because these are still state leased lands. But if they convert to federal lands, There is nothing that says the United States government or military has to do any cultural access on these lands. Any. The fact that these are state leased lands is very, very important. And that's what Ching case is. Okay, next slide. Okay. So these generally are the major leases throughout the state. This is not just a Pōhakuloa or Makua Valley. There's 8,172 acres on Kauai at PMRF that the United States Navy is attempting to lease, and they're waiting to bring their EIS before the land board soon. That is also an August 19, 2029 expiration date. You have the Kokee Air Force Station, which is currently the Air Force. That's going to be NASA for their one of their geo facilities that NASA wants to do. So both the Navy and NASA are co-partnering on that lease out on the island of Kauai. You have on Oahu 3 major sets of land, Makua, Kahuku, and the Paumoho training area. There's also the Kaena Point Space Force Station by the Air Force. And then, of course, Pōhakuloa here. Most of the attention is on the Hawaii Island and Oahu training lands that are held by the Army, but it is not the only leases. There are 2 other services, the Navy and the Air Force, and NASA, and other islands that also have leases that were all done about this same time. Next slide. Brief map, the Pōhakuloa map you're very familiar with. The middle map is the Pacific Mesa Range facility lands at Barking Sands. The leasehold area is the dark purple. The easement area is the light pink. That's on the Mana Plain. And you also have leasehold lands up on the ridge. And then on the right side is your Makua military reservation lands on the island of Oahu, as well as Kahuku and Paumoho. Mostly the front, I don't have my laser pointer, but the front of Makua, where you have about 700, little under 800 acres of state leased land, is the yellow area. And the rest of the valley, over 3,000 acres, is the federal lands. Next slide. So one of the things that OHA has taken a position on is bringing a constitutional amendment in front of the legislature in 2026 to prohibit live fire military training on the state's leased lands. That is a resolution that was adopted at the most recent Association of Hawaiian Civic Club convention. The Board of Trustees has adopted it. We have drafted a bill, and we're going to ask to introduce it in the legislative session, this coming legislative session. We believe in 2025, the people of Hawaii should weigh in on this issue, whether or not live fire military training can happen on the state's leased lands, whether it is being fired from or fired into. Now, why is that important? These next 2 slides will cover that. These are the 2, and not all, but these are 2 of the weapon systems that are fired today at Pōhakuloa. One of them being heavy artillery, M777, lightweight, 155 millimeter caliber towed howitzer. It can fire a range of projectiles up to 24 miles away. This would be for the projectile that can be fired the farthest. But generally speaking, it's anywhere between 10 to 18 miles away is what they shoot from. It's shot by the Army and the Marines. It's highly mobile. It has a digital fire control system. And it's really used for long-range, accurate, heavy artillery fires. The M777 heavy artillery is what is fired from these points. Because if you look at the impact area, you have to get out into these areas to have the range to shoot 10, 12, 15 miles away. So even if these lands came back to the state of Hawaii and the federal government retained these lands and they wanted to shoot the M777 from their own federal lands, if they had access to those lands, it's reducing the range of the weapon system for full operational training. That's why these lands, the pink lands, are so important. The other type of platform they're using most recently is the HIMARS, Mobility Artillery Rocket System. This is also used by the Army and the Marines. It is a light multiple rocket launcher. It's mobile, so it's a shoot and scoot is what they call it, because you can shoot and you can move. Because it is mounted on a tactical vehicle, essentially a truck frame. That one pod has 6 guided multiple launch rocket systems. It can have 1 if it is launched in an ATACMS, but the ones that they shoot at Pōhakuloa are 6. And essentially, it's shooting about the size of almost a telephone pole or half a telephone pole. It is inert. It is using its kinetic energy to hit the impact area. It is being controlled by a fire control system, and it is used heavily for tactical training, especially in the island chain regions in the Hawaii and the Western Pacific. When we asked, what does it take for a soldier or a Marine to maintain annual qualification and proficiency to shoot the HIMARS in a kinetic environment, that would be 2 live shots a year to do that. You can do the non-kinetic training, right? Simulate everything up until the actual projectile coming out of the launcher. But in order for the soldier or the Marine to be properly trained, to be mission qualified, to deploy into combat, they need to shoot that missile twice per year. And they can do that here in Hawaii. They can do that in the Western United States, depending on if they're in the Army or the Marines. They can also do that forward deployed when they go to the Philippines or Indonesia or Palau or other joint exercises where they train with coalition partners. But today, they shoot this at Pōhakuloa. And so if you go up to Pōhakuloa, you will see that it is mobile. It is different than the heavy artillery that is not mobile, right? This thing is towed. Once it is set in place, it's not a shoot or scoot, right? Once it's there until you can use your crew to move it. Next slide. Why is live fire military training important or not important? Well, it does a lot of environmental damage. We know that. Whether it's unexploded ordnance or exploded ordnance, soil contamination, wildfires that occur, habitat destruction, noise and vibration impacts, cultural site damage, dust, air, microparticulates, water impacts. So that is the environmental damage that we know happens from live fire military training here on Hawaii Island. And why this matters for our āina? It's because this is a special place. Our ecosystems are fragile. They are endemic. They are fire intolerant, culturally rich. What happens in Mauka happens in Makai. So what happens in the upland watersheds happens in our oceans. And our island is least equipped to absorb fire, explosive, contaminants, and habitat destruction. That's why live fire military training is a big deal for us, and it's why OHA has taken the position we have taken. Next slide. And
I'll quickly add that it's also why maintaining the state character, the public trust character of these lands are so important, and why the leverage in negotiating lease terms that impose conditions are really important. Our Hawaii Environmental Policy Act is one of the most robust acts in the country. So these kinds of protections are built into the way we enforce land use, land permitting, land access. And so all of these things can be upheld and become very important leverage points if we maintain the state and public land trust character.
Next slide. Okay, so what are the pathways forward? We got 4 pathways, 4 realistic pathways. Land back, lease renewal, land exchange, condemnation. Those are really the 4 that are on the table. Summer, can you speak real quickly to land back?
So land back is basically the ability for any surplus lands, and we went over this in the 5E, if you recall the way that all of the trust lands were identified. This is the federal government's affirmation, its acknowledgement. This is a policy that still exists. It's good law. It's the ability for lands that have been in federal use but are no longer as vital, deemed as necessary to come back to the state as a trust.
So Public Law 88-233 is still in effect, passed in December of '63. It basically nullified 5E of the Admissions Act, and it allowed a perpetuity return of land back from the federal government of the public land trust, or any of those lands held by the federal government, back to the state of Hawaii. And so an option is land back. For example, the federal government in its Army EIS already said that we want to return Makua Valley. The state leased lands, not all of Makua Valley, but the 777 acres of state leased lands, we don't think we're going to need that. We're going to return that back to the state. That's land back. So that's if we can do that throughout the state with all of these different leases, that's a way that we start to get land back into the state of Hawaii's inventory under our state's control.
And because of the government and crown history, the land title history of that, OHA is uniquely poised to receive all of these land backs. OHA and or a Native Hawaiian governing entity is uniquely poised to receive these particular lands.
Next slide. Lease renewal. So lease renewal is definitely one of the options. The Department of Land and Natural Resources is the designated state agency that manages the public lands and the public land trusts. They're the ones that have the most of those lands, and they're the ones that have all these lands that are leased. In order to get a lease renewal, you've got to do and comply with Hawaii's laws, one of which being is HIPAA and HRS 6E. And so in order to get a new lease, and we know these leases expire in 2029, of any term, right? These leases are going to expire. Without any legislative actions, these leases will cease to exist on August 16, 2029. In order to get a new lease of 10 years, of 20 years, of 65 years, you need to comply with the state's laws, right? Which is HIPAA in Chapter 343 and HRS 6E. That requires an EIS, a HIPAA EIS, right? Environmental impact study. That was done. And the Army presented that to BLNR, and the Board of Land and Natural Resources rejected the Army's EIS for both Pōhakuloa and Oahu. The DLNR chair issued a letter on May 14, 2025, we have it on our website, that articulates to the Army why their EIS for Pōhakuloa was insufficient. And if they wanted to address those shortcomings, they could. The Army issued their record of decision to move ahead with their selected alternatives, and currently the Kauai EIS is still pending their presentation in front of the Land Board and or their record of decision. So outstanding issues with lease renewal is impacts to training, especially live fire training or any type of remediation. Part of the shortcomings in the EIS for Pōhakuloa was a lack of adequate cultural and archaeological inventory surveys, a kapa'akai analysis, proper valuation or rent or any type of public trust obligations. Here's another one. In 1961, the new state passed a series of land use laws, and it created the state's conservation district, along with other districts, urban, agricultural. Well, the conservation district is governed by HRS 183C and Hawaii Administrative Rules 13-5. Military training in the state's conservation district is not an allowable use. But because the United States held these lands in either license or they had an easement or they had a permit prior to 1961, they were grandfathered in. So military training on public trust lands, lands leased by the state of Hawaii, is a non-conforming use until August 16, 2029, without the state legislature amending the state's conservation district to allow military training in the state's conservation district. That is one of the differences between Pōhakuloa and the military leased lands there in Mauna Kea, because the state in the late 60s amended the conservation district to add astronomy in the state's conservation district, which is why you have the telescopes and the astronomical precinct on Mauna Kea today, where astronomy use is allowed in the state's conservation district, but military training is not, because it is not an allowable use in the state's conservation district. It is a non-conforming use. When this lease ends, you cannot issue a new lease unless you amend 183C. Go back. Lease must be approved by the Board of Land and Natural Resources. So when you're looking at a lease, and you can, I guess you can go to hold on before you go to the next slide. So there's a couple things that I just want to touch on for the lease. And let's just talk Pōhakuloa. So you have the United States Army, yeah? 3 really important entities: U.S. Army Pacific, where the Army Training Lands Program Manager office is. Army Corps of Engineers, another really, really important entity. U.S. Army Garrison, Hawaii, another really important entity. The Army Program Manager Office in USERPAC is the entity that initiates the EIS. They put out the EIS, they settle on whatever the scoping is going to be of that EIS and what's going to be studied, and then the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers executes that EIS. It holds the subcontractors and the contractors that are hired to do the EIS to their timelines, all the nitty-gritty stuff, all the really important piece. The garrison is where the technical experts are. Up in Pōhakuloa, these are the civilians that are out in the field. They're the botanists, they're the environmental people. That's at the garrison level. But the USERPAC Army Land Retention Office and whoever leads that office is really important in how that EIS is done. The Army will say today, we spent $20 million on an EIS. We followed your rules, the state's laws, and we got the result we got, which was the land board rejected our $20 million EIS. So now we're resorting to what we only see as the only option available, which is possibly condemnation or seizure. Part of that problem is they're not looking in the mirror and realizing that their EIS from the get-go was inadequate. The state, time and time again, told them, you need to study live fire training impacts. You need to do a cultural, archaeological inventory survey that is adequate. You need to look at the biology and the endemic species and all the things that they are required to do. And they didn't do that. And I'll give you one example. If you look at the first draft EIS for the Army's EIS, the cultural impact assessment, or what they call the CIA, was done by Honua Consulting. Honua Consulting did a very robust CIA, and they looked at public trust doctrine, native Hawaiian cultural practices. There's a lot of meat into that. Well, the Army didn't like the Honua Consulting CIA. So Honua Consulting left the project, and in the second draft EIS, there was a new consultant that did the CIA, the same consultant that did the Oahu Training Lands CIA, much more favorable to what the Army would have wanted. And it looked dramatically different than the first draft EIS. Now, normally, when you put out a draft EIS in its first pass, you as the public comment. The Army receives those comments, and they publish a second draft EIS to amend the CIA. Or there's new information. But you don't remove significant portions of what was in the first draft CIA to the second CIA. That's exactly what happened. So the bottom line is, and this, to the Green administration, Governor Green adopted the work that was done under the Ige administration. Because the original scoping, the original work on this EIS was done pre-COVID, 2018 timeframe. And what those conversations were, what happened then, who knows? But the DLNR hardworking staff in the different entities, whether it's OCCL, Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands, Land Division, Forestry, kept telling the Army, you need to do live fire training impacts in the impact area. The Army said, we are not going to do that. This is an administrative action. We don't need to assess the training impacts on our federal lands, even though the state is saying, well, you got to fire from our lands, so you need to assess the impacts. Army said, we're not doing that. And that's what happened. So they refused to do that. I think they were given the generals and the senior military leaders were given bad advice. The EIS was inadequate. They were told time and time again by the state DLNR, you need to do these studies. They did not do those studies. And they got the result they got when it came in front of the land board. And it didn't meet the merits of HIPAA, let alone the merits of NEPA. And in this letter from Don Chang on May 14, 2025, which is on our website, you can read the specific findings and reasons of why BLNR rejected the EIS. it was destined to fail from the beginning. And it is not our fault that you spent $20 million on a failed EIS. You should have done the proper EIS the first time, and you need to assess live fire training impacts on federal leased lands or federal owned lands. You need to assess the cultural kapa'akai analysis, the cultural artifacts, the ecological systems that are up there at Pōhakuloa before we can take your EIS seriously. That's the backstory on the EIS. Next slide. In the EIS, I want to highlight two things. This is in the final EIS for Pōhakuloa, land use. There's a lot to read in here, but what I want to say is Native Hawaiians hold the concept of āina in high regard with a sense of malama āina through the belief that they are genealogically connected to the land. Continued retention or alienation of ceded lands from the public trust intended for the benefit of Native Hawaiians would be a loss to some extent of this connection. Therefore, this continued loss of land represents a disproportionate effect and a long-term significant adverse impact on communities with environmental justice concerns. Any type of alienation of these lands, and they call out, second sentence, in accordance with Section 5F of the Admissions Act, long-term negligible adverse impact from the continued military use of public trust lands. Next one, fee simple title. If these lands are taken by fee simple by the United States, these are also going to have adverse impacts on land tenure due to loss and transfer of land control and ownership of the conservation district from the state to the U.S. government. That's exactly what Summer just mentioned. If these lands become fee, the state has no say. And anything, present or future, that the United States military and government wants to do on these lands, they can and will do. These are two good sections to read. I don't need to read them all, but they're on there. Okay, land exchange. So land exchange is, this is a tricky one, because land exchange, so trading one piece of land for another piece of land, right? We want your state land, here's our federal land, you take this land, we get our land. That is governed by HRS 17195. There are two provisions, HRS 17150 and 17195. And our attorneys and our legal team have determined that it is highly likely and probable, almost with a near certainty, that HRS 17195 governs land exchange to government agencies without public auction. Because normally, HRS 171 would only allow DLNR or BLNR to lease public lands for no more than 65 years, then it must go back to public auction. 17195 circumvents public auction and allows the land board to exchange lands with a government entity, sovereign government like the United States, without going to public auction. It also does not require 2/3 of the majority of the legislature for approval. It also does not require notification of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs. Those all fall under 17150, which is public trust lands to a private entity. But 17195 allows this to happen. So, if the state wanted to trade a piece of land with the federal government, let's say, for example, Kilauea military camp. The U.S. Army says, you know what, you guys can have KMC, we want the pink land of Pōhakuloa. We're like, okay, shoot. Well, first of all, you still got to follow HIPAA and HRS 343, which applies to any action involving state lands or including exchanges. But ultimately, the Board of Land and Natural Resources would have to vote and authorize a land exchange. So there is still a level of protection with the BLNR, and their recent actions in rejecting the Army's EIS, both on Oahu and the Big Island, is promising. However, they would be the board that would have to approve a land exchange between the Pōhakuloa lands and any other federal lands that the federal government controls. So that is a land exchange. The Hawaii State Constitution also has an important role in this, because the state, like I said before, has a fiduciary and a public duty towards the Public Land Trust, 5F of the Admissions Act. It's in the Admissions Act, it's in the state's constitution. Okay, next. And then finally, condemnation. Condemnation is the nuclear option. But it is an allowable option. Under the United States Constitution, the federal condemnation and taking clause of the Fifth Amendment does allow the United States to take land. It must take it for public use. It must provide just compensation, which means fair market value at the time of the taking. Condemnation is possible for national security or military purposes because that would be determined as a valid public use. There's two primary federal condemnation methods: straight condemnation or quick take. Now, for a service secretary that falls under Title 10 of the U.S. Code to take land, which they can do, there's a couple safeguards in there. It requires the U.S. military and the Department of Defense to pursue alternative acquisition methods before initiating condemnation, like, let's say, a new lease or a land exchange. They gotta try to do other stuff before they just come in and say, hey, we're going to do eminent domain, we're going to seize your land, and nothing you can do about it. Condemnation is, but make no mistake, it is a federal taking. It is a seizure through eminent domain. It legally divests the state of its land in exchange for compensation. It is a forced action. It is not a negotiated one. And there is a process, there is a judicial process to go through for condemnation, but at the end of the day, under current U.S. law, there is nothing you can do to prevent it. If the service secretary or the federal government decides that they want to condemn, they can. The state also has condemnation rights. And the city and county of Honolulu is condemning land to build a rail from private property owners. So the state has condemnation rights as a sovereign, and the United States has condemnation rights as also a sovereign. But this is condemnation. Anything on condemnation?
Just that you can, so that good faith effort to have exhausted all of your other options first is actually written into federal law, federal regulation. So that is a guidepost. That is a way to slow down a condemnation train wreck, if you will. And then the just compensation, that can get litigated in court. And that can also often protract the completion of a condemnation process. So there are mechanisms to slow it down. There are legal avenues to, try to mitigate the harm by adding a value to it. But it is the option of last resort. And it should also, that's how everyone should be looking at it and treating it.
And just compensation is really defined as, if you look at the Fifth Amendment, fair market value, right? They would do an appraisal of the land and determine what fair market value is. Next slide. Okay, so what are some pathways for the executive branch? So the executive branch on the federal and the state level, we're going to look at the three branches of government. The Department of Defense has to determine its training, its military readiness needs in the Indo-Pacific. It can initiate condemnation to the service secretaries. This is a Department of Defense instruction 471003 that was executed in 2018 under the Trump administration that requires consultation with NHOs, or Native Hawaiian communities. And it is sitting right here on our website. You can click it, you can download it, and it's crystal clear. And it also explicitly names the Office of Hawaiian Affairs as one of the Native Hawaiian organizations that can be consulted with. So that is something that under the current DoD instruction, until rescinded, the Department of Defense is required to do that. And that is why OHA is asking for a seat at that table to do that. The President can direct military branches and secretaries on land use and training policies, just like the President issued the end to live fire training on Kaho'olawe in 1990. Also the federal government, the Department of Defense, the Secretary of Defense, Secretary Austin ordered the closure of Red Hill. That came from Secretary Austin. Secretary Austin can order the stop and ceasing of live fire training. at Pōhakuloa or throughout the state. So the president and the secretary of defense and the service secretaries have incredible power in this particular decision. And it all depends on who is running the executive branch and who's running Congress, right? Right now, under the current executive branch structure, under the Trump administration, you're seeing what you see. You saw what happened during the Biden administration, where the Secretary Austin shut down Red Hill. Obviously, in the previous administration, they stopped the bombing of Kaho'olawe. Now, what's the state's role? The state's role in the executive branch, you have BLNR. The land appraisal is critical. They estimate $25 to $50 million is the valuation of the land for Pōhakuloa. That is a number that we have heard thrown out there. But we don't have anything concrete. So BLNR really needs to do an accurate valuation of these lands. BLNR also has the authority to approve any lease or land exchange, provided these constitutional statutory requirements are met. BLNR also has an important role to maintain the public land trust inventory system. I'll show you that in a second. Finally, the governor, his role, his job, amongst many other things, is to engage in discussions on behalf of the state. As we saw during previous Supreme Court decisions, the role of the state is a fiduciary for the public land trust. And most recently, the governor sent a letter to the Secretary of the Army on October 29th, which triggered OHA's letter, because the governor described that he wanted to create a joint negotiating team and a technical working group that would be co-chaired by a state agency, and OHA exerted its request to be added to both the joint negotiating team and the technical working group. Let me show you one thing before we go to the next slide, if I can bring it up. That is this. Anybody familiar with this slide, this website? This is the Public Land Trust Information System. This is managed by the Department of Land and Natural Resources. Anybody can create an account. But this technically is supposed to be the site that you can look at public trust lands and where they are. So let's zoom in on Pōhakuloa. You zoom in here and you click on this. According to DLNR's Public Land Trust Information System, and that piece looks really close to the land piece I showed you. You click on parcel detail, and according to this, which obviously is not accurate, the state of Hawaii owns this land. This land is deemed conservation. Its trust status is 5B, so that's where the Admissions Act ties in, 5B, and we know that anything that's in 5B is subject to 5F, which is the public land trust. So you can zoom in anywhere. You can zoom into Hilo and look at lands as an example. Let's look at Banyan Drive. You can zoom in on Banyan Drive. Let's click on this parcel. State of Hawaii, DLNR, 5B. That is the Nani Loa. And I bet not too many people know that on Banyan Drive, one parcel, see if it comes up. Of course, it takes a while to load. Is not that one, not that one. Must be this one. This one. That parcel, just to the right of the Nani Loa, is owned, the only parcel on Banyan Drive, privately owned by a mainland trust. That's the owner of the trust. So that's a public land trust information system, and this is where you can get information on the status of trust lands. As you can see, most of Banyan Drive, I can click on almost any parcel, is going to come up as a 5B parcel, meaning all of these lands are public trust lands per the Admissions Act, and all of these lands are OHA's. We have a vested fiduciary share in these lands. Next slide. Legislative branch, the United States Congress. What's their role? Their role is to appropriate military funding. Their role is also to authorize military acquisition of lands, whether they're regular or quick takings. They do that through the National Defense Authorization Act. Currently, that NDA is in the final stages of being negotiated. That is in the form of Senate 2296, if you go to congress.gov. OHA has asked to be consulted and added to the NDAA. We'll see what happens when it is released. But that is a very important piece of legislation because the United States Congress, through the National Defense Authorization Act, at least in the version that the Senate passed, is creating a 5-year window after, or from this point to 2031, to negotiate a land exchange or a land lease with the state of Hawaii. Our congressional delegation is key in this process, and that would be Senator Schatz, Senator Hirono, Rep. Tokuda, Rep. Case. Rep. Tokuda and Senator Hirono are the 2 sitting members of the House Armed Services Committee and the Senate Armed Services Committee. Case and Schatz are appropriators. The state legislature, they also have a fiduciary duty to the public land trust. But the state legislature, and they're about to convene on January 21st, 2026, has the ability to legislate and amend HRS Chapter 171, governing the Crown and government lands. It would be great if HRS 171-95 was amended to require 2/3 of the legislature to approve any land exchanges. But it is not the case right now. It would also be great if the Office of Hawaiian Affairs was informed, like 171-50 requires within 3 months of the convening of the session, that if you're going to exchange, sell, trade any part of the public land trust, that OHA has to be informed. Neither of those provisions are in 171-95 that we know govern a land exchange between the state of Hawaii and another government entity, meaning the United States. But the ledge has the ability in the upcoming legislative session to address this through state legislation. Any type of legislation like the live fire CONAM that OHA is proposing must be passed 2/3 majority of both houses of the legislature, Senate and House, in this 2026 election year before that question is placed on the ballot. And at the end of the day, the legislature has oversight over the executive branch and the state agencies like DLNR. It has the power of the purse through the budget appropriations process. And so our legislatures, your legislatures, and I hope legislators, and I hope you know who they are really important in this process. And when that legislature convenes, it's game on, right? Because until, when that legislature ends in the first week of May, unless they convene in a special session, which is really unprecedented, it's not happening. It has to happen between January 21st, 2026 and the end of the first week in May. So you know who your House rep is. Know who your state senator is. Voice your opinion to them. Make sure they're advocating for you. Senator Inouye, very important, chair, Waterland Committee in the state Senate. She directly oversees the Department of Land and Natural Resources. She oversees their hearings when they come to ask for their budgets. Make your voice heard to Senator Inouye. Representative Todd, chair of the House Finance Committee, very important person in the state legislature. Make your voice heard with him, as well as the other state reps and state senators. Next slide. Judicial branch. I'm going to let the lawyer, one of the lawyers in the room, take this really quickly. So explain to us the role of the judicial branch, Summer, from a federal perspective and the state perspective.
So given the nature of the claims, which involves federal lands, federal parties, it's a federal court case. And so federal laws would apply. And you are looking, we already talked about it, for condemnation, it really is limited to just compensation and an evaluation process and a good faith that they've followed the procedures with respect to making sure that this was an option of last resort. But there are limited pathways for that. There is also always environmental protection, natural and cultural resource protection, those kinds of claims that can be made and added. There's also got to be a little bit of innovation here. There isn't sufficient case law or precedent for opposing this kind of action with, in particular, the trust character of our lands, which are distinct from the way courts have addressed condemnation in the past. And so you have a lot of Native rights scholars right now looking into the the creative possibility of coming up with new, novel legal claims and principles, but as it stands, the precedents here are limited. In the state court, state claims would be primarily targeted towards breach of trust claims, similar to the way that the Ching v. case was constituted. And going back to sort of the constitutional mandates, the affirming principles in our state constitution that recognize Native Hawaiians as having unique rights related to access, related to cultural and customary practices, and related to OHA's particular role as a trustee.
Yeah. Okay, next slide. I think we only have a few more to go. Roles for OHA. So OHA's, it exists for a couple really important things. One of them is to protect the Crown and government lands from alienation. Like we will fight to the end on the dispossession of the Crown and government lands that are held in trust. And whether they are alienating them, seizing them, we're going to use every tool in our toolkit to do what we can to prevent that. We advance policies to protect the Crown and government lands, including constitutional amendment like we're proposing on live fire training. We receive and manage lands and revenues on behalf of Native Hawaiians, including reparations. We have a compliance team that advances our statutory and constitutional protections. We are always pushing for maximum public land trust revenue to be transferred to OHA so that we can turn those revenues into resources for our beneficiaries. We have asked to participate in those negotiations and be part of the governor's either his advisory group, which Summer serves on, or in a more official capacity in the governor's joint negotiating team or his technical advisory group regarding these particular lands or beyond Native Hawaiian rights in general. We ensure consultation with the community, including a Ka'a analysis. And like I said at the beginning of this presentation, like our goal is to educate, collaborate, and empower community, and we do that through education.
And I will add that the collaboration part is important as well, because we also recognize that we are just one entity and that we support parallel conversations happening in and around community and organized around other Native Hawaiian conveners who are moving the conversation towards anti-condemnation in the same direction. It helps when we coalesce. There is less severing by opposition forces, especially around like Native Hawaiian principles and Native Hawaiian values. But again, this is all sort of everyone working together to amplify the education and the empowerment process, to amplify the activism process, and to hopefully also help everyone who is anti-condemnation and desirous of a process that follows laws, follows regulations, follows Hawaiian values, to coalesce around one another, to find the common thread that keeps us as a solidified sort of coalition.
Yeah, OHA is just one voice, one entity. We really believe that no one single entity, person, individual should make any unilateral decisions on this issue. That this should be a kako thing, that the community should have an opportunity to make their voices heard. And OHA, because of our constitutional role and our statutory role, is like one of the only, it is the only Native Hawaiian serving agency, even more than the Ali'i Trust, that has constitutional and statutory power and legal standing on this issue because of our fiduciary ties to the public land trust, which ultimately are the government and crown lands of the Kingdom of Hawaii. Next slide. So pathways forward, OHA's advocacy to date. We created a permitted interaction group on Army training land retention back in January. We've done site visits to Pōhakuloa. We have had a chance to participate in the EIS process. And we submitted testimony on that, opposing the EIS that was ultimately rejected by BLNR. We've been engaging in policy discussions around next steps to avoid condemnation. We had a major proactive role at the Civic Club Convention and we were able to advance the CONAM resolution on live fire training. We had robust island community meetings and a board meeting November 4th, 5th, and 6th. Many of you were there. Thank you so much for coming. That engaged the community on this perspective. After the governor sent his letter on October 29th, we sent a letter to the governor formally requesting to be on the joint negotiating team and the technical working group. We also sent a letter to the United States Congress, to the Senate and House Armed Services Committee chairs and the relevant ranking members and subcommittee chairs and subcommittee ranking members requesting support of the Senate's NDAA language that pushes the date to 2031, but is a tool to prevent condemnation, while also including the Office of Hawaiian Affairs and Native Hawaiian organizations, just like DoD instruction from 2018 specifies, will be consulted on this issue. And we're waiting to see the final draft of the NDA when it comes out. And then on November 12th, our committee and ultimately the board passed the constitutional amendment to ban live fire training on the state's leased lands. And we authorized our staff to start to consult with the community on the Kapa'akai analysis, so they'll be beginning that soon. We also launched our website on aloha@oha.org. We have a community survey right now. Our statement of principles. We are launching statewide comprehensive educational workshops. The next one is going to be Wednesday, December 17th in Maui, in Waianae. We'll be going to Kauai shortly after that. And there's a lot of information on this website. I encourage you to visit it. It doesn't exist anywhere in the state. We just continue to add to it. So every link on here is really, really important. And some of the historical documents, not just Senator Inouye's letter, but other letters during this time in 1963 and 1959 are on here. And then other articles. And then finally our survey. You can go to the next slide, Summer. So this is the call to action. Okay, we just spent 2 hours and 11 minutes of your night that you can never get back. And I hope it was educational. And I hope you learned something. And I hope you go home tonight smarter and more akamai on this subject. Better able to make informed decisions. And part of that is, okay, what next, right? What is the call to action? So one of them is to support OHA's request to be on the governor's joint negotiation team and technical working group that he sent to the Secretary of the Army on October 29th. We still have not heard back from the governor on that. The governor did subsequently create a military advisory committee, majority of which are Native Hawaiians. 8 out of the 10 members are Native Hawaiians. Summer is on that committee to advise the governor. But we're not looking for an advisory role. We're looking for standing. We're looking for OHA's acknowledgement of our fiduciary, constitutional, and statutory role to the public land trust, and to be a part of any conversations that concern these leased lands, the 5B lands, and the 5F lands that are the same thing. Participate and contribute as part of the community consultation that is coming through a Kapa'akai analysis. Support OHA's amendment to the Hawaii State Constitution to prohibit the use of live fire military training on public trust lands. We are hoping that this makes it to the legislature. It's a tall order. It's like trying to walk up Mauna Kea by yourself, right, to get to the top. 2/3 legislature support, House, Senate in an election year. Ooh, but hey, we're going to try. And if we can bet it to the ledge, we can put it on the ballot. What's your role? Know who your state senator is. Know who your state rep is. Say, hey, once this bill gets introduced, we support it. Leave that decision to the people of Hawaii to choose. This is not 1946. This is not post-World War II. This is 2025. And should live fire training on the state's public leased lands that are part of the public land trust, that are part of the crown government lands of the Kingdom of Hawaii, still be used today for live fire military training? That's a question that each of you can answer on the ballot in November of 2026. Follow OHA's latest efforts on aloha@oha.org. Take our survey right there. It's like 6 questions. It won't take you long, and we really want to know how you feel. And so if you just click on, this is our Military Leased Lands website, you click on the survey, that's it. If you want to send us an email, you can to aloha@oha.org. If you want to share additional manao here, it is anonymous. We're not asking for your name, your email, or anything. We're just asking you to answer these 5 questions. Sign up for OHA's emails and updates. Continue to learn, be informed, know who represents you. There's a way to do that through the Office of Elections website, to be able to put in your home address and find out who your state senator, your state rep is, who your member of Congress is. But this upcoming legislative session, it's really important to know who represents you, and ultimately, you know, we would encourage everyone to vote in the 2026 election. It is an election year, and elected officials want to get reelected. And one of the ways to get reelected is to make sure that your voice, as who they work for, who they are there to serve, that they are representing your voice, and they are listening to you, and they are advocating for you in the legislative session. And that's really, really important. Historically, we don't have a high voter turnout, and we have less of a high voter turnout in an off-presidential year. But at the federal level, 2026 is really important. Who controls Congress is really important, because who controls Congress controls the National Defense Authorization Act, controls the military appropriations. Of course, 2028 is a big year, because who controls the White House controls the Secretary of Defense, controls the Secretary of the Army, controls all of those actors and players that currently, right now, I don't know if they really support the best interests of the people of Hawaii concerning this particular issue, at least for what we've seen so far. Finally, share information with your Ohana and friends. That's what we're asking. And is there another slide? No. I think that's it. 2 hours, 16 minutes. That is everything that we wanted to share with you tonight. Key takeaways. These lands are important. These lands are special. They are part of the Public Land Trust. They're part of the former Kingdom, Crown, and Government lands. OHA has an important role in that. You have an important role in that. Pro-Hawaii, pro-Hawaiian, anti-condemnation. We could start there. There's things that we may or may not agree on, but I think there's a lot that we can agree on. And with that being said, we can open it up for questions, whoever still wants to remain. But for those that are going to leave, thank you so much for taking the time to come. Part of the civic process is showing up. And almost over 100 of you showed up tonight to learn. I just saw Auntie Noi Noi, Wong Wilson here. We have two people on the Governor's Military Advisory Committee in this room, Summer and Auntie Noi Noi, and they're very important people because they carry your voice onto the advisory committee. And so thank you so much for coming, and we really, really appreciate it. But we're going to hang out because we told Olelo that we will be here until 8:30 with the live stream, and so we'll be happy to take any questions you have. Thank you.
You know, some other people may kind of look at this as such a pretty much neat bureaucracy of paperwork, when I see basically the process of malicious intent by the federal government to steal our lands. Very blatantly. It says it right there. You go through all these processes to negate our rights, our attachment to the land. It's right there. You guys pretty much said it. You know, on there, that timeline. Every time, you know, and you know, we used to say like, oh, every time when we try to get ahead, we gotta jump back 2 steps because of this bureaucracy. I mean, I can compare you guys to a homeowners association. Basically, you guys overstepping the bounds. The governor. So, and this is from Uncle Louis, okay, Kai. Because Uncle Louis, we used to argue about, you know, he knows how aggressive I want to be and stuff like that. But he always said, like, Ed, always bring a solution. Okay. Pōhakuloa, this is my solution. Well, I thought it was loud enough already, but... Oh, on the TV. Ah. You know, I don't get paid for that anyway. But my part in looking at this, all this process that you've been going through, my solution, first of all, because of who I see is on the committee that the governor have chosen, and you know, with special things like packets being done before this thing even gets out to the public, you know, being working in federal government before, I know about. Okay. Yeah, but yeah, but you see, you guys got to understand the process. This is another slow genocide. You know, I don't know how you got, you know, good lawyers should be able to see this. They're creating all these things so they can take our land. It's very easy to see that. But maybe I misinterpret the way, the kind of law process should go by. But all I say is that refute this committee. Refute them. All we need, you know, you guys say that you guys only want agency. Well, have the agency with balls to do this. And you know what? Let them record themselves. Let them make themselves known that, you know, right off the face, they're going to show themselves, oh, we're not here for you Hawaiians. We don't believe in your better conditions because they've never done that from day one. So you know what? I don't know. I could have sworn I used my college education to see better. But all I see is corruption. All I see is blindness. You know, now you know why when Daisy Earl set up, okay, like, I don't know why the Hawaiians not voting. Well, maybe it's because they don't trust you. Simple as that. I don't know why they can't figure it out that after all these years. Next one. Thank you.
Yeah.
Aloha, mahalo.
Hi, thank you.
Mahalo Kai for taking 2 hours to share this information with us. At about the 20-minute mark, you passed over a really important piece of information that Mahalo Summer, you pointed out, and then it got passed over again. The Newlands Resolution does not have the authority to cede land. Right. Only a treaty can do that. So in 1988, a legal opinion by the Office of Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice said, it is unclear which constitutional power Congress exercised when it acquired Hawaii by joint resolution. Only by means of treaties can the relation, I'm going to get to my question real fast. Can the relations between states be governed for a legislative act is necessarily without extraterritorial force, confined in its operation to the territory of the state by whose legislature enacted it. There is no treaty ceding any crown or government lands that the United States and the state of Hawaii call public lands. If nothing was ceded, then by what authority did the United States transfer these lands under the 1959 Hawaii Statehood Act? And by what authority did the state of Hawaii lease the military portions of crown and government lands in 1964? These are questions I'm sure you've heard before. And I hope at some point in our history that the chair and the leaders of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs will stand and ask these questions. In the interim, mahalo kai for your work, for the resolution that you're putting forth. Some people may think that we are waiting for the impossible. Martin Luther King said, the arc of history is long, but it bends toward justice. I hold to the words of our kupuna who said, Pono will return to this land. And we wait for that day, even if we have to wait and witness the collapse of an empire that continues to illegally occupy Hawaii. Mahalo.
Thank you. Yeah, no, let her bring the mic, that way they can capture.
Thank you so much. My name is Kāwili St, and I'm from Waikea, originally from Molokai. So I listened to the entire 2 hours and whatever, and again, thank you for your information, but there's a lot of information that is lacking. and that information is lawful. When we have to fight against anybody that's trying to steal our lands, we have to use the law. You know that, and you know that. So let's use international law. There is no treaty. You said it. The Newlands Resolution, that is a U.S. law that cannot go outside the territory or the boundaries of the United States of America. Hawaii is not the United States of America. Okay? So we are suffering, and we are suffering because of the lies. I'm a Christian, born and bred a Roman Catholic. Not proud of that, but I'm a Christian. I believe in God and Jesus Christ. Okay? And the 10 Commandments, thou shalt not steal, thou shalt not lie. So all of us that were brought up as Christians, and if you believe in Jesus Christ and God and the 10 Commandments, it is our fight against those who lie against us. That's our fight. So why use U.S. federal laws? Cannot have a. Why use state of Hawaii laws? Cannot have a de facto. The only thing you can use is international law. So you gave a good dissertation all about the feds, all about the state of Hawaii. Where in glory, Jesus Christ, the glory of Jesus Christ, where are the truth? Where is the truth? International law. Give a 2-hour dissertation on that, Kai. You are very eloquent. You are akamai. And if you don't know it, I know you will learn it. And you can be as eloquent as you are tonight and give that truth to everybody. Because that's how you fight them. Only with the truth. We don't hide, okay? We tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. So help me God.
So,
Thank you.
the one thing I will add to that is that, yes, there is a need for a comprehensive approach. OHA has never taken a position that foreclosing other options or other avenues, other legal pathways need to be pursued at the same time. Having said that, we can look at the UN right now and see what kinds of limitations there are even at the international court level. That the same kinds of impasses, the same world powers control the decision-making bodies of those institutions as well. And we are seeing those world powers dominate, oppress, like literally cause people to be dispossessed of lands that they've held in their communities for generations and dying at the same time. And we are all, the world is sort of ignoring that injustice. So my only appeal is that in addition to pursuing the pathways provided for at the international level, understanding that there is still limitations there as well. We open the news and we see those limitations, especially if you align your values, all of your desire for people to be able to live healthfully and in peace and without being, their limbs severed from their bodies on a daily basis, which is happening regularly. Like, that is not the only pathway we can be pursuing. We have to be pursuing multiple prongs and multiple pathways. And when we say OHA is one entity, we are putting our resources into the pathway where we have the closest proximity to the people in power, the decision makers. That is also why every single one of you should exercise your voices and your position statements anytime you get in proximity to the decision makers and the people who are making laws and actions that impact your lives. That is why, while the advisory committee is not where we are satisfied, we will not be satisfied with being on an advisory committee alone. To the extent it gives us proximity to decision-making power to ensure that our voices, that our anti-condemnation, that our malama āina, aloha āina values get heard, even like at that front door level, that those kinds of positions and perspectives, we are occupying a seat in that space. And we are counting on our lahui to occupy every other seat available to them. This is a kako effort in like the most profound sense, and for this generation's moment. We cannot do this alone. We cannot pursue pathways in isolation. We have to do it all. So mahalo piha to the international scholars and the international lawyers who are dedicating their time, their resources, their energy to pursuing the international pathway. And mahalo, like piha, to all of the native rights trained attorneys and scholars here in Hawaii who are working tirelessly to find pukas in the state law and in the federal law to keep our fight going. And mahalo to all of the practitioners who we expect to be on Pōhakuloa, and we expect to be at Makua. And when you get, unfortunately, like the systems come for you, all those lawyers, all those attorneys, all those advocates will make sure that you are defended, that you are not left alone either. So this is a coalition, and we need to understand that the desire to pit efforts that are all moving in the direction of justice, and that arc that we're talking about is not the most strategic position to be making at this moment in time. The more long-term strategic position to be made is to find the common threads that move as many people forward as possible in the shortest amount of time possible for the longest enduring amount of time possible. I have nothing but aloha for all of the other perspectives. I embrace all of them. I'm grateful that all of them are happening. Let's make sure that we leave space and room for everyone to participate where they feel comfortable participating.
I don't know if I could have said it any better, but this is an open invitation to the governor of the state of Hawaii to come to one of our community meetings and listening sessions, to state senators and state representatives and members of the county councils to come. We're here. We're here and we're convening. And that's okay, because we want to hear from you. We want to bring the information to you. We're going to do it on Oahu. We're going to do it on Kauai. We're going to do it on Maui, and we're not going to stop. Because the more educated our community gets, the better empowered, the stronger your voice is. And so this is an open invitation to all elected officials, including our congressional delegation, to come to any one of these meetings and hear from you and listen to you, and not just watch on TV, because we know they're watching. It's to come and be present and stand here in the moment and listen to the people of Hawaii in one of the issues that are so important to our lahui.
Uncle's turn is on that side, right there.
Yeah, thanks for all your manao. But so from what I understand, I went by memory, but October 2023, there was a notice to cease or terminate Treaty of Pearl River, from the treaty from Pearl River. Now there was 12 months from either party to terminate that lease, and so United States military was given that notice to terminate. So that would bring them into October 2024. You familiar with this?
Vaguely.
Okay. So
I have heard about it, but I don't know what.
now, this was given notice from the Hawaiian Kingdom, or Kingdom of Hawaii, and it's now November 2025, so it's 1 year over to comply to that. And I kind of missed the beginning part of but I walked in right when you were on the subject of Pearl River, yeah? And so, I mean, I'm just thinking out loud kind of and just to bring that up. But actually, my other question was, let's bring that subject up, yeah, something to look into. But when you were talking about all the Hawaii revised statutes, the resolution of the joint resolutions, all the acts that were enacted up until statehood and all, even to the apology resolution, yeah? But when the Hawaiian government was overthrown, 1893, right? Okay, anything that any laws that were enacted after that from the provisional government, Republic of Hawaii, is all null and void, and it's not legal. So even you guys, even OHA is a state of a Hawaii entity, right?
Correct.
When we're standing right here, we're actually in the Kingdom of Hawaii, and it's been proven that in international court that our sovereignty was never relinquished. And so when it comes to them, the military renewing their lease or trying to renew the lease, there's no legal basis for them to do any of that. And they should just stop thinking about trying to renew the lease and start thinking about how they're going to clean up all this mess before they leave. Right?
We're advocating for that.
Yeah, I appreciate that, man.
Thank you so much. Mahalo. We're going to take two more questions.
We get one more over here, though. One more over here first.
Okay, sorry. I called the Hilo office earlier today to ask if public testimony was going to get taken. I was told by Kepa that yes, you guys are taking it. We get 2 to 3 minutes, and that's what I was told. So I actually prepared testimony and not a question. So I'm going to take like less than 2 minutes.
Take your time.
I'm going to read it off because of my ADHD brain.
You want to come up here to the front?
Sure. Yeah.
You can, yeah.
Aloha mai kako ova o sky. Hello again. What just happened in this room is a kind of forced remembering without consent. For many of us, this is not just a history lesson or a case study. These are our stolen lands, our bombed lands, our arrested kupuna, our poisoned āina, and our still unhealed wounds. To be made to sit through that again, especially so close to a day that symbolizes independence, sovereignty, and self-determination, is re-traumatizing. It is unfair, and it is not neutral. Let's call this what it is. The tension in this room is a direct response to intergenerational violence being discussed as policy. While I appreciate the explanation on the public land trust, that trust operates on the assumption that U.S. jurisdiction over Hawaii is lawful. International law asks a different question, whether that jurisdiction exists at all. Under the Hague and Geneva Conventions, an occupying power cannot permanently militarize or destroy occupied lands. That protection goes beyond U.S. trust law. At your last board meeting, I made my position very clear. No land swaps, no lease renewals, no geothermal, no TMT, and yes to full demilitarization of Hawaii. Sorry, not sorry for being here again, but these issues are not resolved. And the so-called, quote, pathway forward does not reflect the people's position. So clearly, OHA is sitting at the wrong table because your beneficiaries are not sitting at that table. I stand here not only for Pōhakuloa, but for all state-leased military lands whose leases expire in 2029. None of these leases should be renewed statewide. Like Kai just shared, PTA is about 133,000 acres total. Of that, about 23,000 acres are state-owned public and ceded trust lands leased to the military, and that lease expires in 2029. Those 23,000 acres fall directly under OHA's constitutional responsibility, as we just heard. Josh Green has publicly warned that if the state does not renew these leases, the federal government could pursue eminent domain. That threat is being used to pressure our people into accepting continued militarization. Under Article 7 of the Hawaii Constitution, these lands are held in public trust, and OHA is a trustee for Native Hawaiian beneficiaries. And under international occupation law, decades of bombing and live fire training do not meet the standard of military necessity. OHA has already acknowledged, quote, unrelinquished sovereignty, and, quote, alternatives to condemnation. This is not just a lease, it is a legal, cultural, and moral issue. So tonight, my 3 direct asks are, number 1, adopt a clear board position opposing renewal of all expiring military leases statewide, including Pōhakuloa. Number 2, publicly reject the use or threat of eminent domain on public trust and ceded lands. And number 3, demand cleanup, independent health studies, demilitarization, and the return of these lands to the people. You are trustees, you work for the beneficiaries, and your beneficiaries are paying attention. Trustees don't threaten beneficiaries, they defend them. And history will remember whether you chose the people or the military. Choose wisely, mahalo.
Thank you.
Aloha piha, o Saralen Lehua Pelican, ko Uinoa. I am a descendant of Native Hawaiians. My grandmothers were Native Hawaiians. They spoke Native Hawaiian, but they did not teach my parents because they were in fear. My father was the youngest of 15. He and his 5 older brothers joined the armed forces of the United States because if they hadn't, Hawaii would not be where we are today. The United States, yes, they took over our country, our native lands. But if we had not had the protection of our soldiers, our loved ones, like Kai here, my brother, who was a Navy veteran, died. All of my uncles, my cousins, who have fought for the United States of America, Hawaii, and the world, democracy and freedom. This is what Hawaii is about. Aloha. We have lost it because people have come here and have illegally been able to steal our āina, our precious āina. What will our keiki have, our mo'opuna have? We've been systemically enslaved for centuries. We've been purposely displaced. And today, we still fight amongst each other. Why? It has to stop for our mo'opuna. All of you, us, we are ohana. Hawaii is our homeland. Our descendants fought for our freedom. I don't care if any of you do not like what I say, but if Hawaii does not have the military here, we do not want them to destroy our land, but we have to have protection because there will be others who will come here, and they have come here. I'm telling you that now. Other Polynesians have come here, and they have stolen our land, and the government allowed them to do it. And I have the proof. I have the proofs. I have the paperwork that will show all of you what the government has done. OHA is here to help us. If we cannot all be together, then it is all for naught. we will continue to be the way we are. Our keiki will not have land. Our Hawaiian homeland. How many thousands of us still not able to get land? Huh? Why is this? And yet the military still bombs our āina. Why? Our keiki. Why mopuna? Your mopuna. We fight for them. I'm only 70 years old, and I could never learn my Hawaiian because my grandparents were too fearful of teaching my parents and me my native language. I am angry, but more so I am hurt that we cannot join together. Allow these young people, these educated people to bring us together. You say God? Yes, there is a God. I believe in God. I was a Roman Catholic as well. My mama, a Roman Catholic. Yes, I believe in God, but God has his ways. And God wants us to be together on this, not separate. Enough already. Our children are mopuna. They suffer because we are selfish. We are selfish. Thank you, Kai.
Thank you.
Good night.
Thank you. Somebody is over here. We get two more. Yep. Here.
Okay, so you was talking about the decision makers, sis. The decision makers and the people of power that the advisory team has access to, and that's why you guys doing what you're doing. The decision makers and the people of power are in this room right here. All of these people that are here from Ko Hawai'i āina and all of our people of the kingdom are the decision makers and the people of power. Maybe in the rooms you guys stay in.
We're here too. We are here in community with all of you. So we are in proximity to the decision makers. You are also.
Yes, but you just went give your whole moving speech about how the people of power and the decision makers that matter to you are on that advisory board. So my question is, because at the last,
Opinions and put them in my mouth.
no, that's just what you said. You just said that, girl.
I have always said this is a Kako effort.
I didn't say you
Everybody-
didn't say it was a Kako effort.
This is a Kako effort, and everybody who occupies a seat next to a decision maker, including the people in this room, have an obligation to share not only this mana'o.
That's not what you said when
that
you
we
were
should
giving
know
your speech.
absolutely.
Anyway, the question that I have is, at the last OHA working
let her
group
ask
where
questions.
it was Kai
Go
and
ahead,
he
ask your
was
question.
talking about, and I had brought this up at the Board of Trustees meeting too, about how you were you said that there is no way that the U.S. military will ever give us back our lands. But then, Summer, you were talking about how it's everybody's kuleana and we all have our different kuleana, and your guys' kuleana is through the legal and the policy route. And so encouraging everybody else to get engaged in civic engagement and things like that. So which one is it? Is it that we can never get it back, or is it like we should try in our own ways to get it back? Because you're both saying different things.
I don't think we're saying different things. We gave several options of different pathways that the end result can result
None of the
in.
pathways were us taking our land back.
Land
all
back?
of the pathways.
No, that was the first
No,
option.
that was the one through the different policies and all the different askings and all those different things. How come there isn't an option up there that is just Ko Hawai'i āina rightfully asserting our kuleana to this āina and saying this is our āina of Ko Hawai'i āina? We're not going through all those other pathways that is fraudulent and that is built on lies and decades and generations of traumas and dramas. But instead, we're going to take what is Ko Hawai'i āinas. How come that option is not up on the board?
Hey, this presentation is a work in progress.
No, but
And
last time I brought this up,
we
and you said that at
appreciate-
the same meeting
you
last
know what?
time,
We
and you
appreciate your
said,
feedback. We appreciate your feedback.
but I gave that feedback last time with a bunch of other people in that room, and then we had the trustee meeting, and more people gave that mana'o. Sky is testament to, she said that exact stuff. And then even now, you going on one world tour on the Pai'aina, sharing false information, and on top of that, pretending like there is no option for Ko Hawai'i āina to rightfully assert our kuleana to have our land back. and continuing to go around and tell everybody, oh, this is the only options, you might as well give it over to the state, and even lay the framework that giving the āina to the state is the right choice, heva.
Okay, thank you. Mahalo for your comments. Next question. Oh, okay, sure, yeah.
Kalamai. I am a Hawaiian. But I also think even if a non-Hawaiian has something to say, that's okay too. Thank you, Kai. I think you're a good person. I'm going to have to disagree with you on some things. So I had 3 thoughts that just wrote down as I was listening to everybody. I went away from this land to learn in another land, specifically the land of the Puyallup tribe of Indians. They put me through boat building school. I said, thank you, but why? They said, because you're going back and teach your people, right? I said, yeah. They said, that's why. So I said, thank you again. But I learned a lot watching there, because they used a model of sovereignty as defined by the United States Supreme Court, which says that Indian tribes are domestic dependent nations. Their legal standing, that both of you eloquently explained how that works with the federal government and the state government, is legal standing only so far as allowed by the United States. See the U.S. Supreme Court ruling that Indian tribes are domestic dependent nations. By never having agreed that we are annexed, we still preserving that option that we someday can have our country back. This doesn't mean we have to be an enemy of neighbor countries, including the United States. Actually, recently the United States has become an enemy to many of its neighbor countries. I have a banner in front of my house in Kaua that has the flags of Canada, Greenland, Cuba, Mexico, Panama, and Hawaii. What do these countries have in common? They're all being threatened with conquest, annexation, domination by how embarrassing. If some people consider themselves Americans in this room, whether Hawaiian or not, I still say that's embarrassing. If some people consider themselves Christian, I'm a Buddhist myself, but some of those Christian values are really good. So I put them on my banner. U.S., love your neighbors. Do not bear false witness against them. Do not covet their lands. Do not threaten, conquer, or annex them. Yeah, so that's a start. Okay, and maybe Governor Green has modified his position since I last read the news, but it sounded like, oh, we got to get stuff, money for needed things. I think nobody's arguing there's needed things, housing, sewage, whatever. But if you're saying we're going to get stuff in exchange for extending this lease, and one thing that the military leader, I'm sorry, I forgot his name, the general, said, well, maybe we can do a land swap. If all the federal lands in Hawaii, as described here, were taken and then given back by the United States, then any proposed exchange would be taking more Hawaiian land by trading previously stolen land to steal more land. I don't think that's an exaggeration. And finally, a negotiation under threat of condemnation is not a true negotiation. It is a second overthrow and annexation. Now, that last little part there, we had another meeting here a week ago. And, we had some people who had some ideas about how to proceed. They're not from here, but they've seen this play out in other places. And one of the ideas was, somebody said, you can't do anything if it's the federal government. You got no options. They can do whatever they want. Actually, that's not true. And so what that person said is, maybe you just start from the position of, no, the lease is not being renewed. That's not happening. Somebody went and rent your grandma's house and they trashed it and said, we can't clean it up, we're not going to clean it up, and by the way, rent it to us in perpetuity from now on. You're going to say, don't rent to these guys, yeah? What's that? Yeah. So that's start from the position of it must be cleaned up. We're not extending the lease. And if the answer is, but if you don't extend the lease, we're going to take it anyway. Take it. You wouldn't blame us that you took it? No. You said we're going to take it if you don't do what we want. Go ahead and take it. Shows the world, shows the rest of the country what's really going on with that, yeah? And so someone else said, I liked it, you do what you got to do. My friend here said, what can we do? We got signs all along Saddle Road saying, emergency stopping only. If I stop and hold up that sign on U.S. federal land or leased land, we'll have a test case because I'll be arrested for, holding up a sign that says, don't rent to these guys. I'm sorry, I don't have any ill will towards people in the military or ill will to people from other countries, including the United States. But I think starting position is do not renew these leases. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you.
Let's end on a happy note. Aloha la ku'oko'a ohana. We have a very important, very special occasion coming up in a few days. And kalamai, o wau o maile la veamaloi, ka'aha hui Hawai'i aloha āina. My pelikikena as of late is Ili Malong. I think she came to the Board of Trustees meeting. Her predecessor was Auntie Leilani Ka'apuni Lindsay. And I've had the distinct honor and pleasure to learn from these mana wahine. Auntie Noinoiwan Wilson, my kumu. Auntie Kale, Auntie Sister Kalamai, that is my auntie. And so I think what happens in this state of confusion and frustration and anger is this whole idea that we have some kind of race war going on, yeah? Big N, little n. Culture war that we have going on. This is a national consciousness that has escaped our people. And that's what causes this frustration and this hooky of just like, what are we? Are we American? Are we Hawaiian? Guess who can be Hawaiian? Guess. In my nation, guess who can be Hawaiian? Tina, you Hawaiian, my babe. I told you that from the beginning. Because those people who fight for Hawaii in Pono and in Kapualoha, that is Hawaii. That is Hawaiian. It is not an ethnicity. It is not a culture war. Yeah? So in this space of feeling hurt and damaged, reflective of our āina, that is continually being bombed, whether PTA want to admit it or not, whether Makua want to admit it or not, we know what is happening because that is our kupuna. And we will fight to the bitter end, with or without the resources. Mikelo havale no. I love you guys.
Antinoi.
You learn well. Aloha mai kako. I don't know all of you well, but I know all of you, and I've seen you in the many spaces that we've shared together. So first, I just want to mahalo Oha for your presentation. Thank you. It's a lot of effort that you and your staff have put into putting together that, and I hope and I know it's available to the public, right? Yeah. There's a lot of learning that we all have to do. And this is not easy for any of us. So absolutely, our position should be return our land, right? Return our land, fix it. But we already see that they return our land and they don't fix it. At least they don't fix all of it. So, what are our choices? Give it back to us anyway. And there's lots of negotiation that needs to take place. Everybody is correct. All the arguments I heard tonight, all correct. And everybody tells their truth. And I lean toward the fact that we all have to do what we can do personally to help get our land back. Because without our āina, we are not Hawaiian. Yeah, and Tipua said that a long time ago. No Hawai'i, no Hawaiians. And every piece that's taken from us is another eha that we carry and the generations behind us carry. But how we do it has to be using every resource we have. And Auntie is right. We don't need to fight each other. We're all trying to get to the same place, really. And some of us have little different understanding or greater understanding because we spent the time to do some of the research. And it's not to say that the international way is not valid. It certainly is. And I aloha all the people who fight that fight, because we can't all be there at The Hague. But our family who is there at The Hague, and other international places, absolutely. We need people to fight for us in the international courts. We need people to be allies from other nations. We need our people to be in the state courts. We need people to be at the county council. We need people to be at the neighborhood boards, which we don't have on our island, but they do have on other places, on Oahu. We need to all be in the fight together. We all need to be saying the same thing. That's how we're going to get it. Not fighting with each other or not saying that only one way is the right way. So, some of my dear friends, I won't mention their names, said, oh, wow, you're going to go on this committee. Do we need to back off? I said, nobody's listening to this, right? Absolutely not. You don't back off. We do. We stand in the streets. We hold our signs. We make our phone calls. We talk to our families. And we apply pressure everywhere. Because we are all fighting for our collective future and for our āina. And there's no greater cause than that. And OHA is doing the same. And our people at the legislature, for the most part, are doing the same. And so, we need to get behind them so that they're brave enough to do the hard work. And I think that's one of the things I saw on the action agenda. We can choose not to vote, and if you choose not to vote, that's certainly your right. But there are other ways that you can support the cause, if that's what you so choose. And so, let's think about those things. And, some of us get to sit in very difficult seats. So Summer and I, there's one meeting so far, and really we spent most of the time introducing ourselves to each other. So there was really nothing substantive, and the governor wasn't even there. So that didn't make me too happy. But we, whether there's any merit in being in an advisory committee or not, it's at least another door, another avenue, another way. So let's all just work together toward that same cause. Because I'm not seeing anything that says, well, let's just give our land back or give it away. Nobody's saying that. So mahalo for spending the time. We're all preparing for a long weekend, families arriving. Some people are making pies, not me. Life goes on, and we need to pay attention to these really big things so that like Auntie said, our grandchildren have a better life. That's why we stood on the mauna, right? And when we stood on the mauna, it was magic. And it can be magic again if we all stand together, okay? So let's just remember that. Mahalo.
Thank you so much. And on that note, I want to just mahalo everyone who came tonight and who stuck through tonight. I want to mahalo the Olelo community media that stuck it out with us, as well as our Office of Hawaiian Affairs staff that worked super hard and stayed beyond their workday to to support this event. Thank you guys and our staff so much for doing that. I want to mahalo all of you for coming. OHA will be in Waianae on December 17th. December 17th, Wednesday at Maili. We will be there for our second presentation, and we encourage, if you have ohana on the Waianae coast in Maili on that side of the island, to come and join us on Wednesday, December 17th at 6 o'clock in Maili. Wish you all a wonderful holiday weekend. For those that are driving out to Ka'u, Uncle, drive safely. Be safe. Mahalo to all of you. God bless all of you and your families. On behalf of the Office of Hawaiian Affairs, aloha and ahuiho. Mahalo.